Wings of Light. Chapter 26, Wings of Light. Rainbow Dash and Soren lounged on the cloud, dozing lightly as they enjoyed the cool night air. Neither of them wanted the evening to end. In the morning, Soren would have to return to Cloudsdale and Rainbow would have to resume her training under Firefly. They wanted to make the most of the time they did have. Sex was obviously off the table, but snuggling was something the two of them enjoyed and was a good way to pass the time as the night ran its course. Sadly, it wasn't to be as Rainbow felt, rather than saw a shape swooping over them and landing on the cloud beside them. Startled by the intruder, Rainbow rolled onto her hooves, Soren springing up beside them as they both looked to the pony suddenly standing in front of them on the cloud. Firefly didn't spare a glance for either of them, instead staring straight ahead at the figure of another pony rising up towards them from Ponyville. Looking down at the pony, Rainbow gasped. She recognized the young stallion's cream-colored coat with gray flecks decorating it, along with his grayish-blue mane and piercing yellow, hawk-like eyes. What she did not recognize were the wings this young stallion was sporting, which did not gleam with the silvery sheen of polished mithril. Perlin. The same, said Perlin Bluestreak as he came to hover in front of the trio of Pegasi, and, before you ask, yes, I did get new wings. It's nice to see you again, Rainbow Dash, Soren. His gaze quickly refocused on Firefly. It's an honor to meet you as well, miss. Firefly, said the pink mare, smiling as she met Perlin's gaze, my student has told me a great deal about you, youngster. Ah, I see, said Perlin, you seem quite strong. Under other circumstances, I would love to take the opportunity to see just how strong, but I'm afraid I have other business at the moment. What other business? Demanded Rainbow, why are you here? My employer informed me that a certain asset of his has escaped containment, explained Perlin, that asset is apparently heading here and might be here already. I believe you've already tangled with him before. Who is it? Asked Soren. His name was Flash Spark, if I remember correctly, said Perlin. Rainbow felt the blood drain out of her face at that name. Her memory conjured up images of the hateful stallion, along with the twisted monstrosity he had become. And he was somewhere near Ponyville now. Where is he? I can't say for sure, said Perlin, I was talking with Dawn about it. According to him, there are only two possible ponies this fellow could be going after. One is you, the other is Fluttershy, yelped Rainbow, already spinning in place to look in the direction of her friend's cottage. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening. Rainbow was about to breathe a sigh of relief, feeling that they might have more time or that Flash Spark would come after her first. However, that relief vanished when her ears picked up a familiar-sounding buzz emanating from the direction of the cottage. The sound pierced Rainbow's ears and she felt a headache building. A few seconds later, the buzz rose in pitch to a shriek and flashes of yellow light lit up the sky. From her vantage point, Rainbow could see streaks of yellow energy stabbing out into the night. Oh no, she whispered, her muscles bunched up as her legs folded into a crouch, her wings spreading as she prepared to leap. She kicked off the cloud, rising into the air and shooting towards the cottage. Only to come to an abrupt halt as Firefly's hoof stamped down on the end of Rainbow's tail, pinning it fast against the cloud. Rainbow let out a pained yelp as her forward momentum was abruptly and painfully halted and she fell back onto the cloud with a grunt. What the hey are you doing? Demanded Rainbow, whirling around to glare at Firefly. You're in no condition to be fighting right now, said Firefly, a grim expression on her face. I can't just stand here and watch, Rainbow snapped, glaring at her mentor. I fought with him before. I was still in training then. That was before your training was as far along as it is now, said Firefly. Your body is in the process of reordering how it uses its magic. In your current state, you're nowhere near your best. He'll cut you to ribbons. A surge of air washed over them. Perlin had evidently lost interest in the three of them and was now heading straight for the conflict taking place in the skies above Fluttershy's house. Rainbow watched him go, desperately wanting to follow behind him, if not overtake him to get there first. Are you saying we should just stand here and do nothing? She demanded. No, said Firefly, giving Rainbow a grim smile, you will stay here and do nothing. We'll go and settle this myself. Before Rainbow could say anything, Firefly was already gone, a pink and blue streak hurtling through the sky. It'll be okay, said Soren, resting a hoof lightly on Rainbow's shoulder. Firefly's probably one of the most experienced knights. She's even stronger than Spitfire is. I just hope she's strong enough, said Rainbow as she intently watched the skies. Fluttershy, please be okay. Rumble looked up from his book. Since he'd gotten back from his date with Sweetie Belle, he'd been reading quietly on the couch waiting for the return of the rest of his family. However, Flitter and Stormfront were apparently still at Sweet Apple Acres and Thunderlane and Cloud Chaser were still out on their date. With no pony to talk to, Rumble settled in for a quiet evening, grateful that Flitter had let him off from his grounding, but wishing she had allowed him to return later. What had made him look up from his reading was the sound of the door to the cloud house opening. Rumble couldn't quite keep a grin from his face as Thunderlane stumbled in through the door, looking dazed and giddy, a dopey grin decorating his face, and his trademark mohawk mane badly mussed. He walked as though he chugged down half a keg of the Apple family's hardest cider, stumbling and chuckling vacantly into the house. Behind him came the reason for Thunderlane's alcohol-free inebriation. Cloud Chaser, decked out in a slinky, jaw-dropping, bright red dress, rushed in, not even bothering to land on the floor of the cloud house. She zeroed in on Rumble instantly, plucking him off the couch and into her hooves, spinning through the air of the living room as she squealed and shrieked with glee. He did it. He did it. Rumble. He finally did it. Cloud Chaser continued to hug Rumble with ferocious vigor, as though he were an oversized stuffed animal twirling and pirouetting through the air. I take it he popped the question then, observed Rumble, smiling even though Cloud Chaser's spinning was starting to make him feel dizzy. About time, too. He did, squealed Cloud Chaser, finally setting her brother and future brother-in-law back down on the couch. Look. Now able to get a better look at Cloud Chaser, Rumble grinned when he saw the necklace she was wearing, a fine gold chain from which dangled a pendant fashioned in the image of Thunderlane's cutie mark. I'm happy for you, said Rumble, chuckling. He'd known, of course, that Thunderlane had been planning on proposing. He'd also known that Cloud Chaser had been getting impatient waiting for said proposal, not being aware that Thunderlane had been waiting until Hearts and Hooves Day like the hopelessly romantic sap he was. So when's the wedding? Asked Rumble, looking between Thunderlane and Cloud Chaser. Considering the question caused Cloud Chaser to calm down a little. We haven't talked about that yet, she said with a sheepish grin, blushing. She was too busy kissing me everywhere she could reach, bragged Thunderlane, having apparently regathered his wits. She was hugging me so much I was practically carrying her home. Please, you know you loved it, said Cloud Chaser, her voice dropping to a sultry purr as she slunk towards Thunderlane, moving with all the grace of a prowling cat. Like I know that you'll love what's coming later. She stopped in front of her stallion, passing just underneath his chin so that her tail could rise up to stroke his lower jaw. Thunderlane's wings shot out and fluttered wildly, and he let out another dopey laugh as Cloud Chaser strutted away from him, swaying her haunches back and forth with each step. Oh boy, said Rumble, rolling his eyes. Grown-ups. His ears twitched. Distracted from the conversation, Rumble noticed a faint buzzing noise that seemed to be filtering in through the walls of the house. What is that? He wondered, looking around. The sound seemed to be coming from outside. Whatever it was, it wasn't pleasant, giving Rumble a feeling like a fly was hovering just inside his ear and he was unable to do anything to get it dislodged. Do you hear that? Cloud Chaser and Thunderlane paused in their antics, looking at Rumble in confusion. In the ensuing lull in the conversation, they too noticed the buzz. Yeah, said Thunderlane, his head rotating as he tried to fix a direction on the noise. What the hey is that? Whatever it is, I don't like it, growled Cloud Chaser, batting at her ears. It's annoying. Frowning, Rumble went to the door and pushed it open. No longer muffled by the walls of the house, the infernal buzz streamed in through the open doorway and went from annoying to painful, inciting a sharp, searing pain in Rumble's ears even as his head began to ache from the noise. Oh, that's awful, cried Cloud Chaser, desperately covering her ears with her hooves. Beside her, Thunderlane was doing the same. Grimacing, Rumble stepped out on the Cloud House's porch and looked around. Now he could tell which way the sound was coming from. His eyes fixed themselves in the direction of the everfree forest and a small cottage situated near its edge. Oh. I've been waiting for this chance, you little brat, snarled Flash Spark. I'll pay you back for what you did to my wings. On top of that, your precious mother will get to watch. Don said nothing, already darting in at Flash Spark, his form a blur that seemed to flicker across the space between them. He came right in at Flash Spark's chest, his wings blurring as he launched a succession of pounding blows that hammered at the insectal stallion's armor, knocking him back through the sky. For all that he appeared to be stunned and disoriented by the blows, Flash Spark didn't seem to be taking any harm, but that was nothing new. Right now, Don's primary concern was forcing him away from Fluttershy and Caramel, as well as Scan and Zon. He'd noticed that the Griffoness had taken some form of injury in the fight and didn't want her accumulating any more if he could prevent it. Hey, protested Flash, his voice cut off as Don slammed him with another thunderous attack. Stop. Let me. What are you? Every time Flash attempted to speak, Don hit him with another attack, knocking him back any further. Already, the cottage was far in the distance behind them and the two were now over a large stretch of the everfree forest. The canopy below was practically a blanket of black in the dark of the night. Flash growled angrily as Don pushed him further and further back, each blow taking him farther away from his intended prey. Knock it off. As he roared out that last word, the blurring of his wings stopped for an instant, the veins running through them changing orientation before they started buzzing again. This time, as they resumed their motion, they released a powerful burst of vibrations through the air, expanding out around him in a spherical wave. Don had been in the midst of yet another attack. As the focused burst of compressed air ran into the wave of vibrations, it seemed to shudder and disintegrate. Frowning, Don reversed the direction of his flight, kicking out with all four of his hooves and slipping his wings from back to front in tight arcs, causing him to skip backwards through the air so quickly that he literally seemed to vanish and reappear several meters back. Using his wind sense to keep track of the strange wave of vibrations that Flash had released, Don readied himself just in case he needed to retreat further. Fortunately, effect petered out before it reached him. That's a new trick, he thought, his mind going back to Morning Star's messengers warning that Flash's capabilities had been upgraded. I wonder what else he might be capable of. Damn it, it's about time, grumbled Flash, I thought you were going to push me out of Equestria. The idea did come to mind, said Don lightly, I figured you might be more at home somewhere like the Badlands. You'd probably find creatures more like you out there. Keep joking, you little freak. Snapped Flash, his wings freezing in place and changing again before resuming, the air now filled with that terrible buzzing noise that seemed to drive spikes of pain into the ears of any pony who heard it. You don't stand a chance against me. Don melded his magic into the air around him, using it to create a space of dead air around him, stopping the vibrations released by Flash Spark's wings from reaching his ears. Unlike the attack he'd used just a moment earlier, these vibrations didn't seem to do anything to disrupt Don's magic. As he did so, Don could still feel the vibrations through his wind sense, which didn't cause him any pain, unlike what it would have done with his ears. He also sensed the vibrations seeming to converge and intensify around Flash's wings. His eyes spotted the flaring of yellow light at the points where the waves were converging, a prelude to that strange cutting attack that Flash was capable of. Sure enough, twin beams of yellow energy lanced out from Flash's wings, stabbing out at Don like bright spears. However, Don had already sensed them and twisted his body around to the side, allowing him to slip between them. Flash compensated by swinging the beams in an arc, causing them to intersect in front of him, aiming to cut Don to pieces from both sides. However, the Colt dropped down before the beams could reach him. Don dropped down and darted forward until he was directly underneath Flash Spark. Rolling onto his back so that his legs and belly were facing up at his opponent, Don attacked. However, instead of the concussive bursts of air he'd been using before, he instead launched twin bolts of lightning up at Flash. The crackling bolts of electricity burst into sparks as they hit Flash's underbelly. But when the sparks faded, there was no sign of damage to Flash's armor. With an angry scream that was almost bestial in nature, Flash charged straight down at Don, his wings already preparing to launch another pair of sonic lances at Don, who skipped sideways just as Flash was about to reach him. Flash changed the direction of his flight just as quickly, cursing Don and firing the lances as he did. Don quickly dipped his flight down and slid to the right, ducking underneath the shafts of yellow and out from between them. Behind him, he could already feel Flash closing the distance between them. It seemed that Flash's overall speed was higher than his. Furthermore, those insect-like wings allowed Flash to fly in virtually any direction at will, not even needing to change his orientation. Don was capable of similar feats thanks to his training in the Gale King. However, that was only for short distances before he had to resume a normal flight. Against virtually any other pony, the unique abilities Flash's wings granted him would have provided him with an overwhelming advantage, but they didn't actually bother Don at all. After all, for all the difference in their individual abilities, Dawn had one major advantage over Flash Spark. Flash Spark was no warrior. He had no real experience in battle. Aside from this one, the only real fight he'd been in was when he'd attempted to crash the wedding of Big Macintosh and Ditzy a few months back and had been headed off by the Wonderbolts and others. That fight had largely consisted of Flash's enemies battering him whilst he tried, rather ineffectually, to kill them. The nearly indestructible armor he sported and the deadly weapons he wielded were largely useless. Because of his lack of knowledge and skill, he had no idea of how to employ them to their greatest effect, having instead relied on their novelty and unique nature to catch ponies off guard. Thus, though he had yet to inflict any actual damage on his opponent, Dawn did not feel overly troubled as he continued to dodge out of the way of Flash's barrage of sonic lances. When Flash closed in, he tried to catch Dawn with the pincers on his muzzle or slash him with the bladed tail extending from his haunches. However, Dawn simply read those attacks and slipped around them effortlessly, not even needing to think about it. This might actually be a good opportunity for me, thought Dawn as he darted back away from Flash's latest attack. Relaxing his body, Dawn took a breath and let go of his thoughts, clearing his mind and falling completely into the feeling of moving in sync with his adversary. Through his wind sense, he could feel the buzz of Flash Spark's wings, feel the shifting of those vibrations through the air as Flash moved to attack or fire off his sonic lances. Just like Flash's breathing, those vibrations formed a sort of rhythm that Dawn could feel through the air as they fought. Even though he was no longer actively thinking about the battle, Dawn easily moved, automatically eluding Flash's attacks. But that was only the first part of Dawn's efforts. What he really wanted to do was test the skill he'd only managed to use once before during the final stage of his battle against Terra Hart. His mind went blank and the fight seemed to be taking place somewhere very far away. Reaching out into the air around him, Dawn began. Against the constant buzz of Flash's wings, a second, lighter buzz filled the air around Dawn as it began to charge with electricity. Putting the force of his entire body into the motion, Dawn swept his wing around, the feathers slashing through the air like blades. The lightning he generated seemed to merge with the edge of the vacuum blade he produced, gaining both power and speed from the motion of his body. In the midst of its blank, unthinking state, Dawn's mind conjured the image of a brilliant, white crescent sweeping through the air. To Flash's eyes, Dawn's body seemed to limp 1 second, almost as though the Colt had lost consciousness in midair. Seeing an opportunity, Flash decided to go in for the kill, aiming to catch the Colt with his pincers and rip Dawn's throat out. However, the next second, Dawn suddenly whipped out his wing, twisting his entire body along his spine to put more force into the motion. From the edge of Dawn's primary surged a blade of white that hummed through the air, the sound of its passage seeming to cut through the buzz of Flash's wings. Flash Spark was not a warrior. He had no honed instincts to sense danger, and even if he had, his reflexes were not developed enough to allow him to dodge. In his own mind, he had no reason to even worry about Dawn's latest effort. After all, nearly every attack that had been used against him, whether pony or griffin, whether it came from a Wonderbolt or even one of the Celestial Knights, had failed to penetrate his armor. This attack was no different. In the end, it wouldn't even faze Flash Spark, who grinned as he continued forward to make his kill. He couldn't have been more wrong. Ironically, Flash's impulse to go in for the kill was what saved his own life. As a result, he'd ended up moving in at an angle that took the majority of his body out of the way of Dawn's attack. The curved edge of the white blade sank into the armor over Flash Spark's upper left hind leg, just below his haunch. The humming crescent of white energy seared and sliced its way through the armor and the flesh beneath it. Flash screamed in agony as his attack was completely forgotten. He rolled one way, while his severed leg went tumbling off in another direction, disappearing into the canopy of the everfree forest below. Streams of blood spurted from the stump where his hind leg had been. "You brat! You filthy mongrel brat!" shrieked Flash Spark, his writhing flipping and spinning his body as his wings kept him suspended in the air. "What did you do?" Dawn said nothing, too dazed from his experience to respond. The last time he had tried this technique, he had been on the edge of exhaustion and depletion, and it had drained his magical reserves past their limits. Returning from that blank, thoughtless state was like trying to claw his way back into consciousness after being drugged or knocked out. His entire body tingled from the experience, possibly because he was new to the technique. His flight faltered as he panted for breath, drained from the endeavor. "I think I can keep fighting, though," he thought. He hadn't pushed himself nearly as far as he had during his battle with Terra Hart, and his recovery from that fight was more or less complete. Dawn was distracted from his reverie by a wet, sliding sound coming from Flash's leg. His eyes widened as he saw the armor lining the area where the leg had been severed spread down and close over the wound, completely stopping the flow of blood. "Well, that's different." Flash's cries of pain dwindled and he seemed to regain some semblance of self-control. His pincers opened and closed in agitated motions as his compound eyes once again focused on Dawn. His teeth were grit in anger. "You're going to pay for that," he said, his voice emerging as a maddened hiss. Dawn frowned, wondering just how to deal with this situation. While he didn't want to kill Flash Spark, however disgusting a creature the stallion might have been, he also saw no other real options at the moment. Even before he had been twisted into this monstrosity, Flash Spark hadn't been a pleasant stallion. But now, it seemed as though the only thing he cared about was inflicting as much pain as possible on the ponies he believed had wronged him. On top of that, the dark matter that made up his armor, wings, and who knew what else of his body was unpredictable. There was no telling what other surprises it might have. Even if he subdued Flash Spark now, Dawn was fairly certain that no form of captivity he and his friends currently had at their disposal was sufficient to handle him. It would seem there's no other way to handle this, thought Dawn grimly. He backwinged, edging away from Flash, trying to gain distance so that he could try his technique again. However, Flash simply charged forward. Even as he lunged in, his pincers aiming for Dawn's head, his wings made the air scream as yellow light flashed in front of both of them. He fired the sonic lances down at an angle, trying to catch Dawn as he ducked beneath the snapping pincers. Twisting, Dawn managed to slip between the shafts of light and sound as they slashed at the canopy below. Flash reared up, swinging his bladed tail and its barbed stinger under his belly. Kicking off the air, Dawn was able to turn his twisting roll into a cartwheeling motion that carried him out of the way of the fearsome weapon. Flash was already turning in place and moving to pursue, once again lunging in with his pincers. Gaining distance would only make it easier for Flash to target Dawn with his sonic lances again, so Dawn remained close, his form seeming to double, even triple as Flash's pincers clicked in a continuous effort to spear the Colt between them. Once again, Dawn tried to clear his mind and relax his body to achieve that thoughtless state once again. However, the increased ferocity of Flash's attack was a continuous distraction, one that kept him from achieving the necessary state of mind. To make matters worse, that infernal buzzing ground into Dawn's ears. This close to its source, Dawn's control over the air around him wasn't enough to keep the vibration at bay, and it was a constant source of pain. As it was, Dawn barely noticed the critical instant when the buzzing of Flash's wings ceased for less than a second, only to quickly resume again. However, he felt the results immediately as a powerful surge of vibrating air rushed away from Flash and washed over Dawn. At this range, there was no way that Dawn could escape from it. The air beneath his wings seemed to go dead and his lift disappeared. Dawn's eyes widened as he began to fall towards the canopy below. There wasn't a serious risk of him falling to his death, not from this high up. The interruption of his magic had been brief and Dawn could already start to feel his control of the air coming back to him. The real problem came from the fact that Flash wasn't going to sit idly by and let Dawn get away from him. Even as Flash's head darted forward, its pincers closing in on Dawn's head, his hindquarters swung downwards and forwards, whipping that tail and its stinger in an arc that sent it stabbing towards Dawn's stomach. In his current state, there was no way that the Colt would be able to avoid the blows. A sound like a thunderclap roared across the sky, drowning out the buzz of Flash Spark's wings. A shaft of white, edged with blue, slammed into Flash's flank, knocking him tail over teakettle with an pained cry. It was accompanied by a cracking noise as the force behind the blow apparently broke through the dark matter that served as Flash's armor. Confused, Dawn looked around, only to be taken by surprise as a pair of warm forelegs encircled him in a protective embrace as a pony pulled his back up against her chest. Despite the fact that this pony had apparently snuck up on him through his wind sense, Dawn felt no sense of threat that the unexpected contact would have normally brought. Instead, it made him relax, almost as though his mother was holding him. At the edges of his vision, he caught a glimpse of pink wings. Firefly. Tilting his head up, he saw her face as she smiled down at him. You did well, she said, all things considered. I don't think it was wise using that skill in real battle yet. You haven't completely grasped nothingness yet, at least not enough to use it at will. Practice some more before you try that again. She transferred her glance up to Flash, who was reorienting himself and growling as he turned to face Firefly. A second pair of Pegasus wings beat the air and Dawn sensed the approach of another Pegasus, smaller than Firefly but larger than him. Perlin. I wouldn't expect anything less, said the young stallion with a smirk as he came to hover next to Firefly. You beat me by a pretty wide margin. He transferred his gaze from Firefly to Dawn. That was quite the trick you pulled. So that was what you've been working up to. So it was, said Dawn with a nod. Perlin's lips curled back in a grin. Well then, in the interest of keeping things even, why don't I give you a preview of what my new wings are capable of? He bobbed his head politely towards Firefly, with your permission, of course, milady. Be my guest, said Firefly. I'm quite curious about your wings myself. They were metal, the last I heard. Perlin nodded as Flash Spark shouted indignantly, are you three going to waste my time on chit-chat or are you going to let me kill you already? Sorry, said Perlin with a chuckle, drifting forward so that he hovered between the other two Pegasi and Flash Spark. I will be your opponent for the time being. You, snarled Flash Spark, his sneer more audible than it was visible. You owe your wings to the same one who gave me this. He gestured to himself and the insectal armor he wore. Why are you helping them? I don't recall why the fact that both of us received our gifts from the same giver would have us on the same side, said Perlin, especially since he actually asked me to cut your little jaunt short. He's apparently upset that you went abroad without permission. An angry growl gurgled its way out of Flash Spark's throat. I don't need his precious permission to do as I please. He told me that this was my power to use as I see fit. I am not his slave. The corners of Perlin's mouth curled up in a tiny, amused smile. If it suits you to believe that, then, by all means, do continue. I have my orders though. He is my employer after all. Flash Spark let out a wordless shriek of rage and surged forward. Perlin rushed in to meet him. Flash's wings froze for less than a second once again, then resumed beating. This time, once again producing that painful buzz that prompted Dawn to lay his ears flat against his skull. Pushing gently against Firefly, he prompted her to let go so that he could snap out his wings and create a bubble of air that cut down on the buzzing's interference. Perlin was undeterred by the noise. Instead, he hurtled forward, his eyes intent on his target. The buzzing rose to a shrill pitch and light flashed out from Flash Spark's wings. Twin shafts of yellow light stabbed out at the young stallion. Dawn tensed. If Perlin dodged or if those beams cut right through him, Dawn and Firefly would have to get out of the way, as they were also in the line of fire. Perlin went into a roll, not to slip out of the beam's line of fire, but instead to swat at them with his wings. The shrieking lances of yellow light glanced off his wings at sharp angles. One went arcing harmlessly into the sky, intercepting a drifting cloud and splitting it in two. The other one seared down into the forest below. A few seconds later, a groaning crash echoed through the night as several trees were felled by a blade far sharper than that of any axe. Perlin completed his roll as he continued to charge at Flash Spark, who was surging forward to meet him. Abruptly, Perlin twisted his body to one side so that he could swing one wing in a long sideways slash, aiming straight for Flash Spark's neck. Flash Spark darted straight upwards without changing his body's orientation, easily shooting out of the line of Perlin's swing. As he did so, Flash dropped his haunches down so that he could swing that bladed tail and its stinger straight at Perlin's head. The arc of the swing brought the stinger swinging down before its course curved up, which would have put it through Perlin's chin, had the young stallion not calmly lifted his head out of the line of the strike, flipping onto his back in midair. Pulling his extended wing back, Perlin swept both wings upwards in a slashing motion that would have cut into Flash Spark from below, like a pair of giant shears. Screeching, Flash Spark shot up even higher, the loud, keening noise of his wings heralding another pair of sonic lances that darted down at Perlin, who angled his wings so that they once again bounced off harmlessly. Dawn frowned as he watched Perlin continue his flip until he was upright once more, then sweep his wings downwards to shoot up in pursuit of Flash Spark. There didn't seem to be anything all that special about Perlin's wings. So far, his use of them seemed similar to how he used his previous pair of mithril wings. Granted, his current pair were capable of deflecting Flash Spark's sonic lances, which would have probably carved through Perlin's mithril wings just as easily as Dawn's vacuum blades had. But for how pleased Perlin seemed to be with those wings, the only thing truly distinct about them was that they normally felt like regular Pegasus wings. Was that what was truly most important to him when he received these new wings? Dawn wondered. Whenever Perlin swung those wings like weapons, the feathers went rigid and their profile changed, becoming sharp, incredibly sharp, sharper than his mithril ones had ever been. Dawn could feel that much through his wind sense. Flash Spark was currently doing his utmost to avoid those swings, something he hadn't done against any other opponent so far. That was to be expected, as even a pony as arrogant as Flash wouldn't foolishly assume that armor made from Morning Star's dark matter would be capable of standing up against a blade that was also made of dark matter. Is that all there is to it, or is there something more? Then, Perlin lunged in yet again, swinging his wings in broad arcs. Yet again, Flash darted back, trying to keep well out of their reach as he tried to slice Perlin to pieces with his sonic lances. However, Perlin swung his wings again, even though he was well away from Flash Spark. Through his wind sense, Dawn felt something change. He was reminded of the first time he had fought Perlin and had encountered the young stallion's wired feathers. The profile of Perlin's wing had changed. However, something else happened as well. What it was exactly, Dawn couldn't say for certain. It was almost as though some sort of seam had appeared in the air along the line of Perlin's slash. Flash Spark screamed. Dawn's wind sense picked up another seam in the air, right over Flash Spark's back. He felt something briefly arc out from it and bite down into Flash Spark's back along his spine, slicing through his armor with ease. Whatever it was retracted back into the seam as quickly as it came and Perlin's wing returned to normal. What was that? Asked Dawn, gaping. It was almost as though he sent his feather by cutting through space itself. I think that may be exactly what it was, said Firefly calmly, her eyes following the exchange intently. We both know that dark matter's greatest strength is that it doesn't conform to the regular laws of physics and magic as we know them. Rather, it obeys its own and produces phenomena by mixing with the physical and magical laws of our world. That trick must be a product of such a phenomena. Dawn suppressed a shiver. The sensation was alien, grating against his senses as something that should not be there. It reminded him of his first meeting with White Shade and the strange feeling he had gotten from the stallion. He realized that it probably should have been expected, since he had been meeting with the dark matter's creator, though he hadn't known it at the time. There was something else he noted. In the process of launching that remote attack, Perlin had actually detached the feather from his wing. In that, it was similar to the wired feathers he had wielded with his previous set of wings. Though Dawn couldn't sense any kind of wire that would be used to control it. But then again, he'd never sensed the wires that tethered the mithril feathers to their wings either. Perlin's pair of mithril wings had been armed with 10 such weapons. I wonder how many he can detach and attack with now. As if in response to his unvocalized question, Perlin swung his wing once again. Dawn's eyes widened as he both felt and saw all of Perlin's feathers detaching, from the primaries, secondaries, all the way up to the covers. The strange seams in the air created by those feathers as they vanished surrounded the wing. But between them, Dawn could feel the wing itself, just the raw limb without any feathers over it whatsoever. Flash Spark twisted and dodged, desperate to escape from the attack. But there was nowhere for him to go as the feathers emerged from the space around him, cutting off all paths of escape and carving into him from all directions. His wings froze in place yet again and Dawn both felt and saw their configuration change. This time, when they resumed beating yet again, a powerful shockwave rushed out in a sphere around Flash, a vibrating wave of force that just barely managed to turn Perlin's feathers aside. The feathers retracted through the seams in the air once again, reattaching themselves to Perlin's wing on the other side. That was a pretty little trick, snarled Flash, but it won't work on me again. I somehow doubt that, replied Perlin with a laugh. It was the kind of trick that could be beaten by someone who's only seen it once, then it wouldn't be worth learning, would it? He shrugged. Although, I'm still getting the hang of these wings, so that's not all I'll be able to do. Which means that for now, this is the extent of what you can do, said Firefly as she glided forward past Dawn to hover near Perlin. It's getting late, so I'll help you finish this. Returning the courtesy, are we? Asked Perlin, glancing sidelong at Firefly. I got an eyeful of your special skill earlier. Are you sure you want to show it to me again? Why not? Mused Firefly idly. Just as you said, a skill that could be beaten just because your opponent figures out how it works wouldn't be worth learning. From his position, Dawn could tell that Flash Spark was seething, mostly because Firefly and Perlin were both talking as though he wasn't even there. Charging forward, he lunged straight towards Firefly, who turned her gaze back to him. She gave the insectal stallion a chilly smile. To Dawn's eyes, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Acting as though she had all the time in the world, Firefly took a deep breath, retracting her wings in and holding them in a relaxed position, not completely folded against her sides but not stretching out either. As Flash Spark blurred towards her, Firefly released her breath and snapped her wings back out to their full span. There was a sound like a clap of thunder and Firefly's wings blazed with pure light that washed over every pony around her with a force that was almost tangible. Its intensity momentarily blinded Dawn, given that his eyes had been adapting to the growing darkness of the evening. As his eyes fought to clear themselves, his wind sense allowed him to remain aware of the situation. Dawn felt the light stream through the air and merge with it. Before Flash Spark could even realize what was happening, a burst of energy, that strange combination of light and air, possibly infused with nothing less than the purest Pegasus magic, rushed out like a lance and slammed right into the middle of his head. A loud crack filled the air as fractures appeared on the armor right between Flash's eyes and he was knocked back, reeling and screaming in pain. Finally, Dawn's vision cleared and he beheld Firefly's technique in all of its glory. Given what he'd seen before he'd been briefly blinded, he'd been expecting her wings to be glowing, shining even. However, what he saw defied all expectation. Firefly's wings were not just emitting light, they had become light. No longer did limbs of flesh, blood, and bone extend out from Firefly's shoulders, but wings of pure energy, pure magic stretched outward, extending farther and wider than her regular wings ever had. They were less like limbs and more like symbols that had been painted in the sky around Firefly with gleaming brush strokes. A long, broad line defined the leading edge of each wing, bending approximately where the joints on a regular Pegasus wing would have been. Trailing out behind each one were feathers, secondaries and primaries, arrayed at their full spread. Though they spread as though they were real feathers, there was space between each one in such a way that no feather was touching another, nor were any of them actually touching the wing. All were formed from brilliant white light, edged with blue highlights. What is this? Asked Dawn, gaping unashamedly at the spectacle. Firefly glanced over her shoulder at him and gave the ebony colt a sad smile. I'll explain once we finish up here, she said softly, an apologetic tone in her voice. Turning back to Flash Spark, Firefly gave him a vicious smirk. Now then, it's time to put you down, bucko. The cracks formed by Firefly's previous blow and the cuts he'd received from Perlin were already mending themselves. There was no way to tell if the flesh beneath that armor was being repaired as well, but it was obvious that Flash was nowhere near done. Letting out an animalistic scream, he surged forward, launching another pair of sonic lances at Firefly. Her wings didn't seem to move more than a fraction, but the result was Firefly becoming a blazing streak as she shot out of the path of Flash's attack, taking a bending, twisting path that seemed to come at him from one angle before diverting to attack from another, then another, then another, a seemingly endless succession of feints in the space of a second. Flash, unable to follow her, completely lost track of Firefly before she charged in at him from behind and to the right. As she came in, the feathers on Firefly's right wing merged together into a large shaft of energy that thrust at Flash's unguarded haunch, landing with a sickening crack as his armor and the bones under said armor broke. The force of the blow sent Flash spinning helplessly through the air. Before he could recover, Firefly was on him once again. This time, she attacked by turning her feathers into a hail of blazing arrows that pounded Flash mercilessly. Broken into chips, his armor was flaking off, revealing the flesh beneath it. Firefly's eyes widened as more of Flash's flesh under his armor became visible. She'd expected to see his coat, or possibly skin. Instead, she found herself looking at raw muscle and tendon. Flash's armor was not merely on top of his skin, it had become his skin. It had apparently bonded with him on a biological level. Furthermore, as more of her attacks landed, she saw cracks spreading through the muscles as well, as though they were made of something similar to the armor itself. It would seem that he has become a creature of dark matter, both inside and out, mused Firefly. Grimly, she decided to continue the assault. She'd come to the same conclusion that Dawn had earlier. There was no hope in taking Flash Spark alive. They didn't have the means to contain him and the unknown capabilities his modifications presented. Furthermore, he was dead set on continuing to threaten Fluttershy, Rainbow Dash, and those close to them. Killing him was the only viable solution. Pulling back her wings, Firefly spread them out to their full span. Their light spread across the sky, blotting out the stars above. She swept both of them at Flash Spark, feathers and the wings themselves merging into a single bolt of light that charged straight for Flash's now unprotected body. No longer content with waiting, Perlin took action as well, charging forward and swinging his wings, detaching his feathers and sending them through space to cut off any path of escape that Flash might have. Through the air, Dawn felt an additional eddy forming in the center of Flash's forehead, caused by something that wasn't there previously thrusting up and out of his skull. Remembering the last time that had happened, Dawn felt his breath catch in his throat. No. Perlin and Firefly's attacks collided with a roar and an explosive shockwave rippling through the air that nearly sent Dawn tumbling. As it was, he had to quickly kick out his wings to remain properly oriented as the trees below cracked and groaned, their leaves hissing angrily as the wind knocked them off of branches and sent them spinning through the air. Directly beneath the center of the explosion, a few trees were blasted into splinters all the way down to the level of the ground itself. The light of Firefly's attack retracted and reformed into glowing wings once again. With a flick, those wings burst into motes of light, leaving Firefly's original flesh and blood wings once again. Perlin's feathers had already returned to his wing. He frowned contemplatively as he stared at the space where Flash had been. I thought there would have been more resistance. Did we blast him to atoms or something? No, said Dawn as he came forward, he's gone. He got away. Author's notes. Happy birthday to me. In the spirit of this most glorious, and by glorious I actually mean completely ordinary of days, I have chosen to celebrate, not by receiving, but by giving. So as a special birthday present from me to you, have not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 chapters. Watch in awe as I show complete disdain for your desire to do things and nail you to your seats for the next few hours. Enjoy. And now, we get to see just what Firefly's technique looks like. I hope it lives up to expectations. Next chapter, Morningstar makes his move. The end. Chapter 35, the end. Dawn Lightwing breathed in deeply, letting his chest swell as he drew in as much air as he could inhale comfortably before letting it out slowly. His body was quiet, the pains plaguing him earlier not bothering him now. His tiredness was still there, but it too hovered off to the side, like faint wisps of cloud swirling around his vision. There it would remain until he'd reached his limit. Only when he had done all that he could would Dawn be content to rest, whatever the results might be. His concerns, his worries about the outcome, the question of whether he could succeed or not were all immaterial to him now. He would do all that he could and whatever came would come. Fear hummed through his veins and Dawn paid it heed, but, at the same time, simply let it run its course, not letting it control him. Rather, he allowed it to illuminate the danger that threatened him. The source of that fear was the single unicorn stallion standing, looking placidly down at a hole in the floor, his eyes searching for the tiniest sign of life. Whiteshade tilted his head from one side to the other, carefully scrutinizing the prone figure down below. The unmoving form of Swift Stride was still visible at the bottom, but had not moved for at least the 2 whole minutes that White had been observing him after finally letting up on the magical assault that had slammed the black-garbed earth pony down through the throne room's floor. It's amazing, he mused, I pounded him continuously until I was fairly certain I'd killed him half a dozen times. Yet, I still don't feel safe taking my eyes off him. A liar is a frightening creature. He makes you doubt your own perceptions, making you unable to trust even the evidence of your own senses. He robs you of your certainty and you view all with suspicion and trouble yourself over every minor decision. From where he'd been cowering against the wall since Terrahart had come into the room, Kambu finally peeled himself away to join his teacher at the hole. Looking down, Kambu lit his horn, a faint, sparkling trail of magic reaching down through the hole in the floor, reaching for the stallion below. Kambu frowned for a moment. His heart has ceased beating. I don't detect any signs of life. I do believe he is dead. White pursed his lips. I wonder, still, there's no point in delaying. Even if he did somehow miraculously cheat death and even manage to fool your examination, there should be nothing more he can do. I checked and there is no further hint of my dark matter on his person. He must have used up most of what he stole in order to work out how it could be used and to make the 2 bombs that he did have. I'm impressed with his ingenuity though. Finally, White stepped away from the hole, looking up at the crystalline column that stood at the end of the throne room, where Celestia's throne itself had once stood and the shadowy figure of the unicorn held within. Things are progressing even faster than I could have hoped. Twilight Sparkle is being surprisingly cooperative in there. I'd anticipated her doing what she could to delay the process, but she seems to even be helping it along. Most likely because she still hopes to hijack the control matrix. Kambu pointed out. She would want to fully learn the array's function in order to safely dismantle it. That is quite true, agreed White, but she won't succeed so long as I can continue to monitor her. It would seem that victory is at hoof. Huzzah for you then. It was not Kambu who'd spoken, but another voice, this one coming, yet again, from the room's main entrance and the shattered remains of the large doors that once barred it. Looking over, White saw the familiar beige figure of Arkenstone, standing resolute just outside the room itself. I'm beginning to understand what the day court must be like for Celestia, said White with a chuckle and a sigh. Ponies coming in, one after the other. Who else is after you, my dear stallion? No one, I think, said Arkenstone, or perhaps not. Spitfire is still able to fight, though she hasn't brought Oranos with her. Firefly has worn herself out apparently. Perhaps Luna might make one last effort to interfere. Ah well, I'll just have to take it as it comes, said White. I suppose you are here to entreat me to stop this foolishness as well. I don't believe you have any intention of listening, so I will save my breath, replied Arkenstone. I will let my actions speak instead. As I figured, said White, gesturing to Kambu that he should stand back. Kambu once again shrank up against the wall, eager to be out of the way of the fight that was about to break out. I saw your mark on Swift Stride earlier, said White. I figured that the two of you had a falling out over what to do about Twilight Sparkle. He wanted to kill her. Naturally, you would object. I did figure that you would be a bit more battered after a fight against an opponent of his caliber. Arkenstone snorted and slowly shook his head, chuckling wryly. You've gravely underestimated him, as have I, again. What do you mean? Asked White, raising a curious eyebrow. I think you'll understand shortly, replied Arkenstone. Arkenstone's tail flicked sharply, actually producing a faint cracking sound. Several pine needles scattered into the air, transforming into an array of swords arranged in the air around him. Those swords leapt into motion, charging at White like a flight of arrows. The air screamed as dozens of razor edges cut through it. The lowest ones raised a trail of dust in their wake, scattering shards of debris as they rushed towards their target. White's wings appeared in an instant, their forms already blurring to intercept the blades. The wings and the flying swords joined with an echoing crash followed by several explosions. Swords were swatted aside to slam into the floor around White, throwing up dust and more debris, all but completely obscuring his form as he waited passively for Arkenstone's onslaught to end. However, Arkenstone wasn't content to bombard White from a distance. Instead, the blind stallion surged forward, charging across the floor. His movement wasn't as fast as Terra's or Swift's had been, but as he moved, he seemed to draw in the dust his attack had raised, which swirled around him, turning black, merging together into plates of black armor, edged with gold. As Arkenstone's initial barrage ended, he came through in its wake, drawing in all the dust that White's defense had raised, not just to form more armor, but blades as well, blades that moved as an extension of Arkenstone's will, many of them larger than he was, slashing at White from a variety of angles. Again, White Shade's wings moved to his defense, parrying the blades with incredible ease. White remained where he was, his eyes focused placidly on Arkenstone, watching with casual carelessness as his wings did the fighting for him. Arkenstone pressed the attack, closing in. One of the wings, having just fended off an incoming sword, swung around to strike at Arkenstone himself. Arkenstone actually leaned towards the attack. The plate over his shoulder seemed to swell in size as it met the incoming wing, which smashed into it with a shattering crash. To White's shock and surprise, the plate seemed to ripple, the ripple running across Arkenstone's body so that it emerged from the other side, the armor there suddenly sprouting blades that arced around at White, moving even faster than his previous ones. One of White's wings was already there, interposing itself into the blade's path. However, to White's complete surprise, the blades only halted for a short instant before punching through the mass of feathers that had blocked nearly everything else that had been thrown at them so far. As a last resort, two of White's other wings beat furiously, lifting him up off the ground and out of harm's way. The blades barely missed piercing his chest. How in the world did you manage that? Asked White, sounding more curious and intrigued than alarmed. Singularity of intent, replied Arkenstone. If I strike, I focus all of myself into the strike, putting every ounce of intention that I have. In the same way, if I defend, I focus my all into defending against the strike. My armor becomes a shield that cannot be shattered and my blades become capable of cutting all. From where he cowered off to the side, Kambu stared in awe at Arkenstone, his mind recalling the name of the technique that Perlin Bluestreak's father had gone to great lengths to ensure the Colt he'd tried to fashion into a living weapon learned. The all-cutting blade, he whispered. Arkenstone's words didn't go unheard by Dawn either, who, as he listened, realized that Arkenstone's words were actually meant for him. The all-cutting blade, conceptually, was capable of cutting through anything, as its name suggested. Properly mastered, there was no substance that could withstand it. Theoretically, fully mastered, it would even be capable of cleaving through abstract entities that could not be cut, entities like Discord, who was living manifestation of chaos, untouchable by normal means. Or dark matter, a substance that existed according to its own laws, all but untouchable by the forces of the mundane world, normally. More importantly, Arkenstone was demonstrating that, in fully mastering the all-cutting blade, its application was not merely limited to offense. By applying the singularity of his intent, he could enhance his defense as well, withstanding White's wings, which had shattered almost anything they struck with almost contemptuous ease. The blade could be a shield, freely applicable to battle in whatever form its wielder required. More importantly, Dawn didn't miss the hidden meaning in Arkenstone's words. Thanks to the efforts of both Swift Stride and Arkenstone, Dawn was now all but forgotten by Whiteshade, who had focused his attention on much more immediate threats. This was Dawn's chance, perhaps the last one he would ever have. He would have to put everything into this strike, all his remaining strength, all his will, the very essence of his self. He would have to ensure it was a blow that White could not block or avoid. Arkenstone held White's attention, but that might only be a momentary arrangement. Whiteshade's dark matter exceeded their understanding. If White realized what Arkenstone and Dawn were doing, he would simply switch methods to one that they were not able to counter so readily. His extremely brief lecture over, Arkenstone surged forward, his blades leading. White's wings turned him sideways so that the three on his left side were facing towards Arkenstone. The wings spun about the point where they joined with White's flesh, spinning like a three-point pinwheel and deflecting the first of Arkenstone's blades. As Arkenstone closed in, the blades returned to him as he raised up his hoof and curled it about the handle of one of them. The others merged with it, causing it to lengthen and thicken until it was a single sword twice as long as his body and easily half as wide. Closing the distance between them, Arkenstone surged forward, bringing down the sword with all the strength his body and magic could muster. Even White, uninitiated as he was in the martial arts, could feel the intense killing intent behind the sword, focused so intensely along the edge that it practically buzzed even to White's unrefined senses. The three wings of his left side moved automatically to intercept the blade, trying to catch it on its sides, away from the edge. However, Arkenstone's downward swing would not be dissuaded. His swing was perfect, directed straight downwards at White's body. One of White's wings tried to interpose itself, only to be cut clean through as the sword continued its descent. The wings on White's right side flapped frantically, carrying him out of the way just in time. The sword split through the air right in front of his nose before carving a line in the floor and through the wall on one side. Even as he escaped the blow, White's wings spun him about like a top so that the wings could slash at Arkenstone. Even as Arkenstone turned to meet the attack, his massive sword crumbled back into dust and reformed as a large, broad shield, catching all three of the wings as they delivered their blow. The shield stopped the wings and shattered in the process. The fragments transformed into blades, which scattered in all directions, ripping apart everything between the two fighters. White's wings whirled desperately, trying to block the attack. However, Arkenstone's attack carried the force of White's previous strike in addition to his own. The wings' feathers broke, shattered, or were even sliced clean through by the deadly hail of bladed shrapnel. White's horn uncoiled yet again, spinning itself into a shape like a clock spring just above White's forehead. The blades that punched through White's wings bent abruptly and then vanished, as though disappearing around the curve of a bend in the air that had not been there before, their forms twisting like a mirage or seeming to suddenly thin out to a paper's width before vanishing. This wasn't lost upon Don, who continued to observe even as he drew deeper into himself to ready for his strike. Arkenstone's offense was overwhelming White's wings and forcing White to use his magic defensively. The wing's auto-defense function wasn't able to keep up with the course of battle, and now White's magic was picking up the slack. More importantly, this meant that White himself was now an active participant in the fight rather than a passive observer. Until now, he had been content to let his wings do the fighting on their own. Acting automatically, their reflexes surpassed his own, allowing White to simply sit back and let them do their thing, chiming in with his offensive magic at his leisure. Now he was forced to concentrate on the battle, following it with his own senses, concentrating even harder if he wanted to actually keep up with what was going on. White was no martial artist. The fight was moving at a speed that no ordinary pony could hope to follow in order to pick out all the attacks and defenses being employed. Whiteshade wasn't even a battle mage. There was no way his senses, however acute they might have been, could have kept up with the battle's pace. His response indicated that he was also probably using his magic, whether internally or externally, to make up the difference, possibly altering his perception of time to allow him to follow Arkenstone's attacks. But such an action required more attention, more concentration, and all of that was being focused on Arkenstone. Little by little, Arkenstone was drawing all of White's senses into the battle, capturing his full attention until White would have none to spare for anything else going on. Dawn knew his opportunity was approaching. All right, now what? Rainbow Dash blinked as she stared up at the white crystalline column with strange, feathery etchings on its surface. Through its smoky interior, she could make out the shadow of twilight sparkle being held within. Rainbow, Fluttershy, Rarity, Pinkie Pie, and Applejack were all arrayed around the column. At first they had spotted the fight going on beyond the column and beyond the hanging projection of the array's central focus. However, their elements called to them, pulling them back towards Twilight's prison. If the elements themselves knew what needed to be done, they weren't sharing that information with the girls. Instead, they pulsed quietly, as though waiting, gathering their strength. To Fluttershy, the feeling was almost like having a living animal draped around her neck. Having worked with all sorts of animals, including predators, Fluttershy was fully familiar of that vague feeling of tension. She'd seen it in the cats she'd taken care of hunting mice in the wild, of manticores in the Everfree, even in the timberwolves that had nearly killed her before Dawn had come into her life, that feeling of an animal tensing, right before striking. The elements were like springs coiling, gathering all that potential within themselves until the time came to release it, a time that was near at hoof. When it came, Fluttershy knew it would only be an instant. They would have to time it perfectly or they would fail and the world would likely end. What do we do? Asked Rarity nervously. Wait, said Fluttershy, focusing all of her attention on Twilight's form, we'll know. White's wings looked worse for wear. Their forms were tattered, broken and cut, feathers streaming off continuously. While the feathers replenished themselves, Arkenstone's blades seemed to cleave through them just as quickly. Both the swords and the wings were practically indistinguishable to the naked eye now, white and black blurs flickering through the air between White and Arkenstone. Occasionally, a sword or a wing would strike marble and scatter fragments of it into the air. If any of these were heading in White's direction, Arkenstone's magic surged through them, transforming them into blades, increasing the speed and force with which they flew, adding to his onslaught. White continued to defend stubbornly. His horn remained in its flat coil over his head. Blades that managed to force their way through his wings bent sharply and vanished. As Dawn watched, he noticed that something strange was happening with White's eyes. It was as though White suddenly sported extra irises. One was practically sitting next to his original one, but others hovered on the edges of the whites. White was using the qualities of the dark matter that made up his own body to enhance his senses and follow Arkenstone's attacks. Whilst the organic matter it was composed of emulated the flesh and blood of a normal pony to some extent, it too was matter that abided according to its own laws. His nerves, when pressed, thickened and intensified, making blue lines appear under his coat, like veins spreading across his skin. In this enhanced state, he felt and saw the world around him much more keenly. At the same time, he was able to freely adjust his sensory input to keep from being overstimulated, keeping him from being harmed by that tactic as well. As he and Arkenstone continued to trade blows, White looked for an opening to take the offensive. He saw a few such opportunities in the space of a hoeful of seconds but hesitated each time. He was not a fighter. Making a critical decision in the midst of combat and taking a risk to gain the upper hoof were alien actions. White had always fought with the comforting knowledge that his dark matter made him superior by a sufficient margin, that he needed no such skills. Being in battle with an opponent who could press him to this extent was a discomforting experience for him. Finally, White decided to take his chances. Instead of keeping his horn in its flat coil, it extended out into a helix shape and flared. Arkenstone froze in place, his swords braced against White's wings, holding them off. For a second, it seemed that nothing happened. Then Arkenstone's armor twisted and warped around him, bending in impossible ways, almost looking as though it had turned rubbery and elastic. It pulled away from him in every conceivable direction, pulling back from his skin. Had Arkenstone not had his blades up fending off White's wings, he would have been in a position to be cut down that very instant. Something snapped and Arkenstone's armor finally broke, shattering back into dust around him. Beneath it, Arkenstone's fur was matted with sweat and his skin beneath it was pale. Both Dawn and White could see his strain plainly. Though Arkenstone had weathered White's magical assault the best of all the ponies that had been targeted by it, it was plain that holding it off had been a difficult effort for him. The dust swirled back around, immediately reforming Arkenstone's armor. White attempted to press his advantage, but Arkenstone immediately redoubled his offensive, even risking thinning his armor by adding to the number of blades he was wielding. With a grimace, White drew his horn back into its flat spiral over his head. How is he this strong? Wondered White. Having seen the state that Swift Stride had been in, White had assumed that the fight between the two Celestial Knights had been vicious indeed. But Arkenstone seemed much fresher for the ordeal, though his late arrival suggested he had not been the winner. It's almost as though he'd gotten the opportunity to rest up after his fight against Swift Stride. But he wasn't nearly far enough behind for that to be the case. If anything, I think he arrived a few minutes before he revealed himself and observed the end of my fight with Swift Stride. How does he have the wherewithal to press me this hard? White wanted to ask but figured that this was a query that Arkenstone would not be so willing to answer. As for Arkenstone, though his attacks were even more furious and intense than before, he was all too aware of his approaching limits. In spite of his apparent vigor, he was in nowhere near as good a shape as he seemed. Much to his irritation, he had Swift Stride to thank for being able to go as far as he already had. Once again, Swift had turned Arkenstone's own style of magic against him. The last bomb Swift had used in their fight had been filled with the scent of lavender, the aroma of which was frequently used to calm and soothe ponies in aromatherapy treatments. Swift had used the scent as a channel for his magic, sending it straight through to Arkenstone's brain in a tactic that Arkenstone had been specifically avoiding falling to during earlier stages of their fight. Doing so had put Arkenstone to sleep almost immediately, dropping him like a sack of bricks. In that state, Swift would have easily been able to finish him off. Instead, Swift had left Arkenstone unharmed and headed for the throne room. If anything, the 2 or so minutes that Arkenstone had been asleep had been some of the most restful he'd ever experienced. He'd awakened, feeling as though he'd slept much longer, having managed to recover a substantial amount of the stamina and energy he'd lost in his fight with Swift. Without it, Arkenstone wouldn't have been able to press White nearly as hard as he already had. If I hadn't fought with him, perhaps Swift would have been able to end this fight on his own, thought Arkenstone dully. Though, if that were truly the case, Swift wouldn't have bothered with threatening Twilight. All Arkenstone knew was that, at the moment, he was able to push White's limits. But that wouldn't last forever. For all that he held something of an advantage over White, Arkenstone couldn't seem to find the opening to administer a decisive blow. It looks as though I'm going to have to leave that to him in the end, he thought. As White backed down from the onslaught of swords that hammered at his wings and threatened his body continuously, Arkenstone felt his own strength and stamina reaching their limit. Even if he drew in the power of the earth to extend himself to his fullest, putting everything into his assault would drive even the most proficient practitioner of earth pony magic to their absolute limits. It's time. I hope Dawn's ready. Abruptly, Arkenstone abandoned all defense, shedding his armor completely. Instead, his swords both multiplied and lengthened, surging forward like a tidal wave of razor edges, completely filling the space between him and White. They crashed over White Shade like a breaking wave, moving so swiftly that it was impossible to track a single one's movement to a normal pony's perception. White's eyes rolled wildly in their sockets, spinning so quickly that their myriad irises and pupils appeared as red and black blurs, the unnatural motion not resembling that of a normal pony's eyes at all. His wings blurred even faster, but they were unable to full stem off the onslaught. Broken feathers filled the air like a cloud around him. The flat coil of his horn tightened until it resembled a single flat disc with a spiral groove etched into its surface, looking like a unicorn's horn had been mashed down and flattened into a plane. The swords that hammered their way past his wings once again bent or thinned out of existence before they could reach him. Finally, White's wings shattered completely, the feathers exploding away from him, running all the way down to his shoulders. Funny, he thought the last time this happened, I was faking. But now it's happened for real. The swords rushed in, clearly hungry for his flesh. White's horn began to spin in place, its motion make the spiral grove that decorated its surface seem to wind inwards on itself. The barrage of Arkenstone's swords twisted and vanished, as though they were being drawn into a vortex around White, disappearing in almost invisible, spiral lines in the air around him. Arkenstone sagged, gasping for breath as the last of his swords vanished into the mysterious vortex of White Shade's defense. He was spent, having thrown everything he had into that last attack. His entire body felt numb and even the earth itself felt distant to his hooves, though he was standing right on top of it. Silence descended on the throne room, punctuated only by the occasional clack of falling masonry. White's eyes returned to normal and the blue lines lacing his coat faded away. His horn elongated before recoiling back into the shape of a regular unicorn's horn. White opened his mouth to speak. What he intended to say would never be known because, in that instant, the one pony he had completely forgotten about appeared behind him. The ebony form of Dawn flickered in right behind White, crossing the distance between the stallion and his resting place in an instant. Dawn's wing was shining white, every feather standing out starkly as he held it out, arrayed like a large blade. White barely had time to begin glancing backward at the incoming attack, his eyes going wide as he realized what was happening. However, it was nowhere near enough as Dawn rolled his body to put all his strength and weight behind the motion as he swung the wing downwards. The feathers cut a white line through space itself, seeming to disconnect everything on either side when viewed from head-on. From the side, it was a crescent of pure white that sliced outward, its edge sinking, unhindered, into White Shade's flesh as Dawn's attack struck home. Abruptly, the girl's elements flared brilliantly. Their eyes widened as they realized what it meant. Now, shouted Fluttershy. They wasted no time. A beam of colored light lanced out from their elements like a quintet of brightly colored spears, stabbing through the column to reach the figure of Twilight Sparkle concealed within. Her shadow immediately blazed violet to match the light of the incoming beams, all of them melting into a swirling rainbow as they came together, washing over and around Twilight furiously. The column exploded in a blaze of rainbow light, the sound of something shattering accompanying it. Dawn put everything he had into that attack, all of his strength and magic, all of his will and intention, focusing everything into his intention to cut White. There was nothing else to think about, neither attack nor defense. All that mattered was this one strike. White did nothing, could do nothing. The blade cut into his flesh and then cleaved through it with frightening ease. It swept through and past him, carving a line on the floor and wall that intersected with the one that Arkenstone's sword had left earlier. With a groan, the wall crumbled away, leaving them with a view of the open air beyond. White's body was split in two, both halves falling away from each other, as White's crimson eyes stared at the Colt who had finally managed to bring him down. Dawn's hooves hit the floor, most of his momentum spent on launching the attack. However, his legs buckled as he landed, sending him into a sprawling roll as what inertia remained sent him tumbling. He came to a stop, laying on his side, gasping for breath. He felt dazed and tired, ready to fall asleep at any second. Luckily, he didn't feel the strange empty, disconnected feeling he'd had at the end of his fight against Terra Hart. Back then, Dawn had been so sapped of strength that he hadn't even been able to think coherently about his surroundings. Hopefully that means I won't require another magic transfusion, he thought, wincing at the idea of spending another few weeks feeling hobbled and helpless. The two pieces of White Shade's body hit the ground, his eyes still locked with Dawn's. The Colt was thankful that he'd had that chance. It was ironic that a lesson he'd once learned during a snowball fight of all things had finally helped him bring White down. A pony is at their most vulnerable when they are assured of victory. White Shade, feeling that he'd weathered all that Arkenstone could throw at him, had abandoned his defenses. His wings had been destroyed. At that moment, the one pony he'd forgotten had attacked and finally succeeded where everyone else, even Princess Celestia herself, had failed. A twitch of motion from White's corpse drew Dawn's attention. Looking over, Dawn's eyes widened as he saw that White's body was beginning to move. No, that's not possible. To Dawn's horror, White Shade's body turned a ghostly white that washed over his coat, mane and tail, the two halves suddenly dissolving into some kind of string-like substance, as though his body had been woven from thread that was unraveling. The strings spiraled into the air, weaving about themselves, yet never tangling until both halves of White's body had completely unraveled. To Dawn's growing horror, those threads spiraled downward, weaving together, forming legs first, then his body, gradually rewinding back into the form of a pony from the bottom up. Finally, White Shade stood there, his whole body a deathly pale color for a few seconds, even his eyes turning a ghostly white before his original colors washed over him once more. Well done, said White, an earnest smile on his face. I have never been pressed that hard in all my life. Granted, I haven't been in all that many fights, but you have done better than I'd ever thought possible. How? Asked Dawn, stunned by this reversal of their fortunes. My body is composed of flesh and blood, said White, but not the same kind of flesh and blood that normal ponies have. It is an organic dark matter that I created. Creating inorganic matter was actually much easier for me. Organic matter is more complex and, at first, my body was continually breaking down. Fortunately, my friend and former student, he gestured to Kambu, who began to step away from the wall once again. Dot was able to help me improve the design of my organic matter. He was the one who designed Perlin's mithril wings, by the way. The improvements actually emerged as a byproduct of the work we went through to provide Perlin with his new wings. Naturally, because my dark matter flesh is different from mundane flesh, it has different qualities. My internal organs are actually more like a viscous mass than distinct body parts. By altering their arrangement, I was able to avoid fatal damage, even though I'd been cut in half. I was then able to reconstitute myself using the quality of those particular forms of dark matter that drew them together, even if separated. Of course, doing so was actually a very intensive process, especially when you'd caught me off guard like that. It took all my skill to carry it out before your blow actually killed me. This is so unfair, grumbled Dawn. Such is the way of the world, replied White. I created my dark matter to make the world more unfair in my favor. Dawn tried to get up, but his body refused to obey him. This time, it wasn't fear, just sheer exhaustion. His attempts to move manifested only in a tired twitch. In any case, it would seem that this fight is over. White tilted his head as he regarded Dawn. I was right to believe that you would exceed my expectations yet again. It disappoints me to have to kill you at this juncture, but it's apparently going to be necessary to ensure there is absolutely no more interference. His horn began to uncoil once again. Farewell, Dawn Lightwing. You made things truly interesting for me. A light began to shine up through the center of the helix. Suddenly, White froze. The light coming from his horn died like the flame of a candle being snuffed out. His eyes went wide. A cracking noise echoed through the room. Its source was not the broken walls or the crumbling floor. Instead, it came from White's body itself. Looking down, White saw a black line running up the length of his foreleg. What's this now? I thought I'd fixed this problem. The crack lengthened, spreading further up his foreleg, branching out. White's eyes narrowed as he regarded it. He seemed to be concentrating, trying to repair the damage. But the crack only grew even more. More cracks formed on his other legs. The first foreleg affected actually began to crumble, pieces breaking off and disintegrating into dust. Oh, I see, said White, suddenly relaxing. He chuckled and smiled at Dawn. I guess you won after all. What? Asked Dawn, blinking. Maybe that wasn't your intention, but by forcing me to bend the entirety of my attention to surviving your attack, you gave Twilight Sparkle the opening she needed to take over the control matrix for my array. She's also apparently learned how to manipulate or, at least, break apart my dark matter, as evidenced by this. He lifted his crumbling leg to emphasize the point. In fact, she'll probably start dismantling my array any second now. As if in response to White's words, a giant crack appeared in central focus a short ways behind him. Then, just like White's own body, it too began to crumble away into nothingness. Looking back and seeing it disappear, White let out a tired sigh. It seems that it's over for real this time. You're taking this awfully well for a stallion who just had his life's work destroyed, said Dawn. White shrugged and chuckled. Oh well, I told Celestia and Twilight and any pony else who tried to talk me down that they were perfectly within their rights to try and stop me. It would be petty of me to begrudge the fact that they succeeded. Very few ponies meet their end having completely satisfied their ambitions and meeting all the goals they set out to do in their lives. I came farther than most. His body was beginning to crumble faster now. I didn't think she would kill you, said Dawn. I can't help but admire her brilliance, admitted White. I completely underestimated her. Come to think of it, I underestimated all of you, especially that swift stride. It would seem that I fell for his lies once again. His lies, mused Dawn, thinking back. He remembered stumbling upon Swift's first attempt to kill Twilight and the words the black-garbed stallion had spoken. Both Dawn and Firefly had mused that Swift's true interest didn't lie with killing Twilight but that it was a lie of some sort. For what reason and for who had been a mystery, until now. I see, thought Dawn, he went through with that farce because he wanted to give Whiteshade the idea of connecting Twilight's sparkle to his array. In doing so, he actually placed Twilight in the perfect position to ultimately destroy the array if she got the chance. Everything else revolved around breaking White's attention away from her so that she could follow through. A magnificent deception indeed. White's body was almost completely gone by now. The focus of the array behind him had crumbled away into nothing. Behind it was what remained of the column where he'd imprisoned Twilight's sparkle, a brilliant light like the sun in miniature, blazing away from within. I suppose as ways to die go, this one isn't so unpleasant, said White with a chuckle, the breaking of his body reaching his neck. Farewell, Dawn Lightwing. You made things truly interesting for me in the end. With that, White's head and horn crumbled away into dust that seemed to blow away in the early summer breeze that drifted in through the holes Dawn and Arkenstone had opened up in the wall. Silence descended upon the throne room once more. Nearby, Dawn heard slow, heavy hoof steps. Looking over, he saw that Arkenstone was laboriously making his way towards Dawn. His breath came in deep, gasping pants as he made his way over. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I got run over by a train, replied Dawn, and you? I feel wrung out like a towel, replied Arkenstone. He turned his head and his unseeing eyes towards the column. Swift Stride is never going to let me live this down. I fell for his tricks again. Is he alive? Asked Dawn. I'm sure of it, replied Arkenstone. I can still smell him down through that hole, but his body is gone and there isn't a whiff of death coming from where he was. Impossible, objected Kambu. I checked his vital signs myself. That stallion was as dead as Eep. He realized that he'd gotten the attention of both Dawn and Arkenstone. We will deal with you later, said Arkenstone grimly, his nose twitching as he sniffed in Kambu's direction. For your own good, I suggest you stay put. If you make me go through the trouble of hunting you down later, I will find you and I will cut off all 4 of your legs to make sure you can't go anywhere. Is that understood? Kambu let out an inarticulate squeak and sank down to the floor. Snorting lightly, Arkenstone turned and regarded the light shining from the dais where Celestia's throne had been. Shall we find out what Twilight is up to? I'm not in any condition to go there under my own power, replied Dawn tiredly. He heard the sound of rustling wings and a set of hooves touching down lightly next to him. Don't worry, said Fluttershy, her voice barely a whisper, I'll take you. Dawn was feeling so tired that he barely noticed her wrap him up in her arms and hold him close as she began to fly across the throne room towards the light. Nor did he notice the thunder of countless hooves as shining armor came rushing in through the main entrance, as many of the royal guard as could be spared following on his heels. Arkenstone went to meet them, their voices fading into muffled whispers to Dawn's tired mind. Fluttershy sat down on the dais, settling onto her haunches so that she could hold her son, hugging him tightly, but gently, as she turned her eyes to the shimmering sphere of light that now blazed where the column that had imprisoned Twilight had once been. Now where am I? Mused Twilight, looking around. Her body was still present, which either meant that she had retained the awareness to rebuild her form in this intellectual space or she was in a different realm altogether, with her body along for the ride. The last thing she remembered was feeling Whiteshade's awareness falter. She'd felt his mind turn away from her completely. In that moment, Twilight had leapt upon the chance. The calculations for the array had been a hair's breadth from completion, but she'd managed to figure out how to take control of the array itself and bring it to a halt. From there, she'd felt the power of her friends flow into her as she worked out the magic she needed to bring down the array and Whiteshade with it. She'd felt the power of her own magic surge within her and, in that moment, she'd been in complete control of everything. She'd felt the different foci of the array arranged in the large circle around Equestria before she dismantled them. Then she'd turned her attention to the central focus and White himself. By then, she'd completely worked out how to use her magic to defeat his dark matter, ironically using the very information he'd been pumping into her mind ever since she'd been imprisoned by him. She'd discerned the keys that held White's body together and used them to dismantle him, right as he'd been about to kill Dawn and Arkenstone. It had been a near thing, but she'd succeeded. And then darkness had swept over her, not the darkness of unconsciousness but genuine, who turned off the light's darkness. Though her hooves felt as though she was standing on something solid, Twilight could not shake the sensation that she was floating through empty space. Though there was no source of light to be found, she could see herself clearly. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting for any sign of what to do, light suddenly appeared. Images hanging in space drifted outwards from the point of light, forming a hallway of pictures leading down into the light. As Twilight looked at one of the images, she was shocked to see her friends and herself at the celebration in Ponyville following their saving Princess Luna. Looking to another, she saw her friends fighting over the extra Grand Galloping Gala ticket Princess Celestia had sent her. These are my memories, Twilight realized. For a moment, the crisis she had been involved in was forgotten as she skipped from one memory to another, gleefully recalling happy moments from her time with her friends. Here was a memory from her first winter wrap-up. There was her dealing with Applejack's stubborn pride during Applebuck season. The memories came one after another, warming Twilight's heart. After a short time, she remembered where she was, or rather, where she should have been. That's right. Why am I here in the first place? Where am I? I believe I can answer those questions. A gasp escaped Twilight, whirled towards the voice, her eyes going wide and tears spilling out. Princess Celestia. Hello, Twilight Sparkle, said Celestia, stepping out from amongst the drifting memories. A gleeful Twilight rushed to her mentor and embraced her enthusiastically. I was so worried, said Twilight, a sob working its way into her voice. We didn't know what happened to you. I know, and I'm sorry that I worried you, said Celestia, gently nuzzling her student's mane. I felt a Whiteshade's power and was unable to stop him. You and your friends were forced to contend with the consequences of the mistake I made many years ago. I'm glad that you succeeded. Why, you're not dead, are you? Asked Twilight. No, said Celestia with a shake of her head, I am very much alive. I suspect you have the power to help me get out of Whiteshade's prison, once you return. You said you could explain, said Twilight. What is this place? This place is many things, said Celestia, but most importantly, it is you, the sum total of your life, your experiences, your identity. You've seen your memories here and they have shown you the source of your joy and strength. But what does it mean? Asked Twilight. In order to defeat Whiteshade, you drew upon the strength of your friends and your faith in them to create a completely new kind of magic, explained Celestia, not merely a new spell, but a new kind of magic entirely. When you did so, you reached the pinnacle of your power. She wiped away a proud tear. I had always thought that you would reach this point someday. I never thought it would be like this. Things rarely go the way we plan. I'm not sure I understand, said Twilight. You will, replied Celestia, when you return to your friends, you will see the results of your hard work and your bond with them. The light from which the images of Twilight's memory streamed suddenly increased in brightness, spreading out to swallow up everything. Author's notes. Next chapter, the beginning. The beginning. Chapter 36, the beginning. The large sphere of light slowly began to drop towards the dais. The ponies watching it all took an involuntary step back. Even to the non-unicorns, the magical power humming through the air was impossible to not notice. There was an enormous amount of energy contained within that sphere. If it were to let loose all at once, it would probably destroy what remained of the royal palace and take out a good chunk of Canterlot and the mountain it rested on in an instant. Nearby, closer to the walls, the air seemed to twist in on itself. The warping feeling unsettled all the ponies nearby it. Fearing some kind of attack from an unknown source, the stallions and mares of the royal guard, with shining armor in the lead, turned to face the distortion. Something white seemed to blossom out of that space and drop to the floor with a thud. Oof, gasped Princess Celestia as she dropped to the floor. She had definitely seen better days, bruised, battered, and bleeding from her fight against Whiteshade. I guess Twilight doesn't quite have a perfect grasp on that magic yet, she said, otherwise I certainly hope she would have been more gentle about getting me out of there. Princess, exclaimed Shining Armor, coming forward to examine here, are you all right? I will be, said Celestia, giving her captain of the royal guard a tired smile, I'm sorry to have worried you. How is Luna? She'll be doing better, now that she knows you're safe, said Shining with a sigh of relief. Already, one of his subordinates was preparing a scroll for Shining to make his report on to send to Luna via Spike. At the dais, the sphere touched down to the floor. It suddenly brightened exponentially, nearly blinding every pony who was watching it. Then the orb cracked and shattered as though it were made of glass, fragments of magic flying everywhere. The ponies nearest to it braced for an explosion, but were only met with a light tickling sensation as the shards of light passed harmlessly through their bodies. Standing there, at the center of where the light had been, stood none other than Twilight Sparkle, standing tall and proud, the new additions to her drawing every pony's attention as a pair of wings with lavender feathers flared out from her back dramatically. Twilight, shouted Pinkie, seemingly ignoring the presence of Twilight's wings in her eagerness to tackle her friend to the floor with a hug, we were all so worried about you. I'm super duper ultra glad that you're okay. I'm glad too, Pinkie, said Twilight, laughing as she returned the hug. Suddenly she noticed that the rest of her friends were staring at her with mouths hanging open. What? Twilight, said Rarity, darling, don't take this the wrong way, but you're an alicorn. Letting go of Pinkie and getting back on her hooves, Twilight laughed. Very funny, Rarity, don't be silly, of course I'm not an. She paused as her wings twitched. Looking back over her shoulder, Twilight saw the feathered appendages growing out from her shoulders and her eyes went wide. Eek, what the hey are those doing there? Screeching in surprise, Twilight spun a full circle as she frantically tried to get a proper view of her wings. Laughing lightly, Celestia limped up and smiled down at her. Be at ease, my dear Twilight. I told you that you would see the results when you returned. Twilight stopped and blinked up at her mentor. So, you mean? I'm an alicorn. That you are, said Celestia warmly. All right, exclaimed Rainbow Dash, now taking her own opportunity to swoop in for a hug, a new flying buddy. Fluttershy raised a tentative hoof, still using her other foreleg to hold Dawn against her. Does this mean that Twilight is a princess now? Twilight gaped at Fluttershy. She thought over Fluttershy's question before looking at Celestia. Does it? As a matter of fact, it does, said Celestia, smiling widely. Congratulations, Princess Twilight. Her limbs still shaking from her confinement and the damage she'd taken from Whiteshade, Celestia sank into a bow before Twilight. One by one, each of Twilight's friends followed suit, along with Shining Armor and the members of the Royal Guard arrayed behind him. Twilight watched them all, a strange feeling rising up in her stomach. It wasn't a completely pleasant feeling either. That feeling became even worse when she saw two members of the crowd around her in particular bow. Dawn had finally been released from his mother's embrace so that she could bow properly. Though he barely had the strength to stand, Dawn tried to mimic her movements, lowering himself as far as he dared before he determined that dipping down any farther would dump him unceremoniously on the floor. Beside him, Arkenstone likewise sank into a bow. Please, stop it. If I'm going to be a princess, then it won't be like this, said Twilight. Walking over to where Dawn and Arkenstone were, she gently helped the colt back up. Look at you. You can barely stand. Don't do this. She looked from Dawn to Arkenstone. I owe this to you too. If you hadn't been there and distracted White, I would have never managed it. Please don't bow to me. She turned to her friends next. And what kind of princess would I be if you girls had to bow to me? Please get up, all of you. Twilight's friends looked to one another and got to their hooves. Fluttershy once again took Dawn in her arms and held him close as she watched Twilight gently berate the guards, including her brother, into rising. Please, said Twilight, tears coming from her eyes, please don't shut me out. I couldn't shut you out, even if I tried, said Arkenstone, gently nuzzling into her neck. This doesn't change anything, Twilight said softly, returning his gesture, I still love you and I still want to be with you. I know, said Arkenstone, things have changed, but the most important thing hasn't. You are still you, Twilight Sparkle, the mare I fell for. I'm glad, whispered Twilight. It looks like everything is going to be all right, said Fluttershy as she rested her chin on the top of Dawn's head. You, Arkenstone, Twilight, you saved every pony. When Dawn failed to answer, Fluttershy looked down in worried confusion, only to break into a radiant smile at the sight of her son, who'd fallen asleep in her arms. I think we all could do with some rest, said Celestia. After that, we can worry about cleaning up the mess Whiteshade made of things. Let's head out. I need to reassure my sister. Fixing the damage done by Whiteshade would not be an easy task, nor a quick one. Though he had died, much of the dark matter he had created remained behind, including that which he'd used to fortify the royal palace. In many parts of the building, that dark matter was all that was holding the palace up. Twilight could dismantle the dark matter, but would have to do it little by little as the engineer corps of the Royal Guard reinforced damaged sections and marked them off for reconstruction. The prisoners were another concern. Now that the dark matter they'd been imprisoned in had been stripped away, they had to be returned to their confinement before they thought about using all the chaos of the situation to escape. Fortunately, they were even more drained by the fight than the ponies of the Royal Guard had been. To the relief of Celestia, Luna, and Twilight, the casualties of the battle were limited. However, they weren't non-existent. Several ponies of the Royal Guard had been killed or critically injured, some of them ending up maimed for life. Their families would have to be notified and consoled. Some of the prisoners who had been impressed into White's fighting force had been killed as well. However, compared to what White had planned and how things could have gone, the toll was very light indeed. In the days that followed, things proceeded at a feverish pace. Celestia had immediately set out to reassure the populace that a terrible threat had been averted and that the danger had passed. There was still plenty to be taken care of. Besides helping the injured and repairing the damage to the palace and Canterlot, plans were also in the works for Twilight's official coronation, as well as the celebration to follow. Pinkie Pie threw herself into the thick of things, bringing all her party planning skills to bear. All of Twilight's friends returned to Ponyville to reassure their friends and family before coming back to help with everything, though Twilight and Spike remained in Canterlot to assist with the reconstruction. The only other pony of their group who stayed behind was Rainbow Dash, partly because the Wonderbolts were still in Canterlot, but mostly because there was one particular pony she didn't want to leave hanging. "How are you feeling?" asked Rainbow Dash as she settled next to Soren's cot. Soren coughed a little before looking up at her. "Well, they patched up my lung just fine. I have to breathe into this weird doohickey a few times every day. The doctors say it's to keep me from developing pneumonia. It's gonna take a little while before I get my wind back up to performance level, but I'll be fine." "Good," said Rainbow. "Firefly says I've pretty much finished learning the wings of light. All I need is to get used to using them. I'll finish up my Wonderbolts training and we'll be ready to go. The rate my healing is going, I'll probably be back up to speed by around then," said Soren with a grin. "It looks like I get to win my bet with Spitfire after all." Snorting, Rainbow gave Soren a reproachful look that made him shrink back. In the past, such a look would have been accompanied by a good-natured whack to the back of the head. But instead, Rainbow sighed and bent down to nuzzle her cold friend. "Geez," she said, "what would I do without you, you big blue goof?" With a wheezing chuckle, Soren captured her lips with his. "I don't know," he said when they parted, "but I'm glad we don't have to find out." "So you're back," observed Flaxseed as he watched Rarity buzz about her workroom, gathering up a bolt of fabric here before nabbing a roll of ribbon there. One by one, each of the items that she'd picked were sorted into different suitcases to be loaded up for the return trip to Canterlot. "Indeed," said Rarity, pausing only a second to give him a reassuring smile, "I for one, am glad that this whole wretched business has come to a close. Once the rest of Equestria learns how the Cult Solar were just pawns for Whiteshade's scheme, that should put an end to that problem as well." "One can only hope," said Flaxseed with a wan smile, "but I wouldn't count on it going away completely. The Cult Solar managed to endure 1,000 years after Princess Celestia denounced them. Ponies don't like being told they're wrong, even when it's the princess saying so. They'll ignore the truth, especially if they find it inconvenient. I don't think we've heard the last of the Cult Solar." "Probably not," said Rarity, pausing in her preparations to come over and gently nuzzle Flaxseed, "but while there's breath in my body, I'll make absolutely certain that they never do anything to you." Her affection made Flaxseed blush. "Thank you," he whispered. "Would you like to come to Canterlot with me?" asked Rarity, her request surprising him with its suddenness. "The coronation will be a large, messy affair, but we can keep out of the thick of things very easily. Princess Celestia also has some smaller, more private ceremonies planned." Flaxseed sweated a little. Canterlot was a city crowded with ponies all around. All the same, if he never worked up the nerve to set out beyond the Carousel Boutique or beyond the boundaries of Ponyville, he would never truly be free of the Cult Solar, even if the shadows of their members never darkened his doorstep again. His fear, as it was right now, was not the rational response to danger, but a poison that tainted his soul until he was afraid to do anything. Poison like that needed to be drained. But draining poison was not a comfortable experience in the least. "I'll go," he said finally. "I can't promise that I won't hide in one of the rooms until everything is over, but I'll go." "That's good," said Rarity, her eyes twinkling. "With Coco up there already, I was afraid you might get lonely here by yourself. It's a weight off my mind." "Well then," said Flaxseed, "I'd better start packing." "Ooh," squealed Pinkie Pie as she bounced madly around the room, looking into drawers and opening up closets. "I'll need hats and streamers and cakes and streamers and punch and streamers and music and streamers and all kinds of snacks and streamers. Oh, and did I mention streamers?" Mayweather rolled her eyes, fighting to keep from breaking down laughing at Pinkie's antics. "Yeah, I think you might have mentioned streamers. I think you've packed enough that you'll be able to mummify the entire population of Canterlot with streamers. The palace is going to look like ground zero at an exploded confetti factory." Pinkie gasped hard enough to lift her hooves off the ground. "You're right. How could I get so carried away I forgot the confetti. Thanks, Mayweather." Mayweather planted a hoof against her face, even as she chuckled dryly. "That's so Pinkie. I think you got confetti already," she said instead. "Come on. We need to get the stuff you did remember to the station so that it gets there all right. The way you're carrying on, we're gonna need at least 3 trains to get it all to Canterlot." "You're totally right," said Pinkie, nodding with so much energy that her head became a blur. A half an hour later, they'd managed to haul the boxes out of Pinkie's secret party planning room. Mayweather was still astounded by the fact that Pinkie had somehow excavated out an entire space underneath Sugarcube Corner, one apparently large enough to hold a small city's worth of party supplies. It helped that her preternatural skill at stowing things away gave the impression that the room and all the storage spaces within it were bigger on the inside, but then again, knowing Pinkie, they might well have been. Mayweather stood at the counter panting for breath while Pinkie rushed off to fetch a cart to carry everything. Mayweather was grateful that her friend wasn't going to suggest that they try hauling all the party supplies over to the station without a cart, though she thought that Pinkie might have half a mind to. With a clink, a glass was placed next to her. Looking up, Mayweather saw Cupcake filling the glass from a pitcher of lemonade. "You look thirsty," the older mare explained with a warm smile. "Thanks," said Mayweather, taking the cup and draining it gratefully. "I should probably make Pinkie sit down and drink some." She's been working twice as hard as I have. It might be a good idea, said Cupcake, her smile faltering a little. Pinky always seems to have so much energy that it can be hard to tell when she's pushing herself too hard until she hits her limit. You're good for her. Me, exclaimed Mayweather, her eyes widening in surprise. Cupcake nodded. I think Pinky needs some pony like you, someone to keep her grounded, give her life a little sense of calm. Her friends are nice, but they're just as wild as she is in some ways. Thinking about the myriad ways Pinkie Pie's closest friends could behave made Mayweather nod in comprehension. Cupcake continued, it makes me glad that Pinky has someone like you for a special pony. Mayweather had just refilled her glass and taken another sip. Cupcake's words made her sputter and spray her drink across the counter. Coughing a second to clear her throat, Mayweather regained enough self-control to gape at her employer. Me, her special pony. Cupcake surprised Mayweather again with a confused look. You aren't. You two had gotten so close that I thought you were. Mayweather thought it over. She could see where Cupcake's assumption could come from. After all, she'd been on the receiving end of plenty of warm hugs and gentle nuzzles, sometimes even a quick kiss on the cheek. But Pinkie Pie was so openly affectionate that it was hard for Mayweather to say that what was between them could actually be special. Though she'd genuinely been attracted to the Pink Party mare for some time now, Mayweather wasn't certain that Pinky would ever see her as anything other than a former cultist in need of rehabilitation. If you're uncertain, I suppose you'll have to ask her, said Cupcake with a wink, but I'm fairly sure that Pinky feels that way about you. Later, after Mayweather had ensured that Pinky was properly hydrated, the two of them made their way towards the train station, hauling the cart full of party supplies behind them. As they pulled the cart, Mayweather looked over at Pinky and blushed nervously. Pinky, she asked. Yeah, asked Pinky, looking back at Mayweather, her beautiful blue eyes making Mayweather's heart dance. Are we special ponies? She asked. Pinkie Pie came to a halt so abruptly that the tug on the harness nearly yanked Mayweather off her hooves. Pinky, looking over, Mayweather could see Pinky staring at her in shock. Oh no, I've blown it, thought Mayweather, desperately hoping there was some way to salvage the situation. If they couldn't be special ponies, they could still be friends. Sure, things might be awkward for a while, but... Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you didn't know it, thought you already knew we were a special ponies and just didn't say anything. You guess a forkatoskin virgo and fancy dates, totally miss it, that can you ever forge of my promise to make it up to you as soon as Pinky's rapid fire tirade came to a halt when Mayweather placed a hoof over her mouth. Pinky, said Mayweather, smiling much more happily now, just stop. Her mouth still plugged, Pinky nodded. Mayweather could feel that Pinky wasn't trying to talk around the hoof in her mouth anymore. Now take a deep breath, said Mayweather, lowering her hoof. Pinky complied. Now, said Mayweather, her smile getting wider, just say yes. Nodding eagerly, Pinky nearly shouted, yes. Much better, said Mayweather, I'm sorry I didn't understand you well enough to realize it. I'm glad to be special ponies with you. So am I, said Pinky excitedly. Then she paused and thought for a second, tapping her chin. But I did forget something really important. What? Asked Mayweather. This. Before Mayweather could inquire as to what this was, Pinky had slipped out of her harness so that she could throw her arms around Mayweather and pull her into a passionate kiss. Mayweather squealed, first in surprise, then pleasure as the kiss continued. Whatever else, thought Mayweather cheerfully, even as she rolled her eyes at her filly friend's over-the-top enthusiasm, being with this mare will never be boring. Ya think this one's gonna cut it? Asked Applejack, hefting the barrel onto her haunches. I'm fairly certain, said Red River with a chuckle, Rainbow Dash did rate that barrel the highest. You've got a point there, agreed Applejack with a titter, Rainbow may be a tad obsessive about cider, but she knows a good one when she tastes it. Personally, I think you could go with any of them, Red pointed out, having a few different blends might be something those city slickers would appreciate. Ha, barked Applejack, now we're starting to sound like a country stallion. I learned from the best, didn't I, said Red with a chuckle before he kissed her, what about the other ingredients? All the apples are loaded, said Applejack, oh even brought some, oh the winter silk apples TWI put under that spell, oh hers. I don't think they're much good fair bacon though. Too much juice, said Red as he nodded in agreement. He might not have been much good at baking or cooking himself, but he did remember Applejack's lessons about what apples were good for what purpose. It helped him when he was listing what apples went into what baked goods whenever he ran the stall in town. Yep, agreed Applejack, they're mighty good on their own, so maybe those hoity-toity Canterlot types'll like them straight. Maybe, said Red, though he had his doubts. Even if winter silk apples, raw and unprocessed, were rejected by the Canterlot elite, they would probably be liked well enough among their friends and the ponies coming from Ponyville to join in the festivities. Every pony from the little town had been invited after all, many of them having come to be at least casual acquaintances, if not friends, with Twilight during her time living there. The presence of so many country bumpkins was sure to raise the hackles of the snobbiest members of the Canterlot elite, at least the few who remained after the noble court had been essentially gutted, but with the newly minted Princess Twilight throwing her support behind the idea, they would just have to lump it. The two of them finished loading up their cart and Applejack hitched herself in to begin pulling it. Red walked by her side. He'd recovered enough to manage an easy walking pace, but not enough to help her pull. With the last of Terra Hart's magic out of his system, the doctors at the hospital had promised that Red's recovery would accelerate as he put himself through his own rehabilitative training. He didn't mind though. Now that his wandering days were done, Red had decided that it was perfectly fine to take his time as he regained his strength. That time would be well spent building a new life with the mare beside him. Twilight yawned as she trotted into palace quarters that Celestia had given her in Arkenstone. As the door swung shut behind her, the stallion, who was lounging on the couch, lifted his head up, withdrawing his hoof from the book he'd been reading. Long day? Asked Arkenstone, slipping off the couch to greet her. Very, replied Twilight, every kind of dark matter has to be dealt with differently. I'm still sorting through all the information I acquired when I took over Whiteshade's array. It's going to be years before I learn everything about his work. Fortunately, the dark matter he infested the palace with is fairly basic. It's just a pain in the plot to remove. The two of them exchanged a quick kiss before Arkenstone led Twilight back to the couch. Letting her spread out along the cushions, the stallion moved above her as Twilight spread out her wings. Arkenstone began by pressing his hooves into Twilight's neck, moving them slowly and carefully, massaging away the stress she'd accumulated over the course of the day. How is planning going for the coronation? He asked. A heavy sigh escaping from the mare below him told Arkenstone nearly as much as her words when she spoke. It's a nightmare, she replied. I'm so glad that Pinky is taking over when she gets back with her party supplies. Otherwise I'd just as soon have Celestia notify the country with an editorial in the Equestrian Times and be done with it. That might not go over well with the aristocrats, said Arkenstone with a chuckle. Despite his humor, it was a notable point. Even if the noble court had been dismantled by Celestia, Canterlot was still occupied by a swarm of ponies belonging to Equestria's upper class, representing everything from old money fops to wealthy business tycoons. Though the nobles were mostly gone, there were still plenty of snobby ponies left from the creme de la creme of the Canterlot elite. Those prodigiously pompous ponies can kiss my righteously regal royal rump, replied Twilight with a snort. The only reason I want to go along with this at all is because Celestia's asking me to. That drew a snort from Arkenstone's nose before he leaned down and pressed his lips against Twilight's neck, making her squeal and squirm a little before he pulled away and resumed massaging her muscles, moving down to the space where her wings met her shoulders and gently pressing into the muscles that had formed there. Those muscles were especially sensitive to his touch. Before she'd become an alicorn, Twilight had never had those muscles and bones there before. The wings bombarded her with strange sensations she'd never felt before as she struggled to learn how to control limbs that Pegasi spent their entire lives with. In between tending to Soren, Rainbow Dash had given Twilight all the lessons she could, with both Firefly and Spitfire to provide their own input. Still, Twilight felt she was a ways away from actually being able to fly. All her attempts so far had barely managed to get her into the air, and she struggled with the basics of flight that most Pegasi learned before they even had their cutie marks. Still, if there was one upside to having to learn how to deal with wings after never having them before, it was having Arkenstone tend to them at the end of the day, using his hooves to knead the muscles and gently press against her joints. The pleasurable feelings made Twilight sigh and melt against the couch cushions, her stallion seeming to draw the stress of her day up through her spine and push it out through her wings with his hooves. By the time he'd moved on down her spine, Twilight lay nearly catatonic beneath him. You are the best, she groaned as Arkenstone worked his hooves in slow circles along her barrel. Thank you, replied the stallion with a chuckle, feeling for knots in Twilight's muscles. Have you given any thought to what you're going to do after your coronation? Go back to Ponyville, replied Twilight sleepily, run the library, spend time with my friends, maybe save the world a few more times. She giggled at that last one. I'm not going to force myself to change my life just because I have a pair of wings now. Life will always change, said Arkenstone, a slight chiding tone in his voice. You didn't want your life to change before Celestia sent you to Ponyville in the first place. Maybe I will do something different someday, replied Twilight, maybe something more princess-like. But I'll do it on my terms, not because it's what every pony expects me to do, now that I'm an alicorn. Besides, she turned her head so that she could fix one eye, which twinkled with mischief, on Arkenstone. I'll be wanting to stay close to my teacher. Arkenstone raised an eyebrow. Your teacher. I may have wings now, but that's not the only thing that's changed, said Twilight. Being an alicorn means I have earth pony nature too. I need to learn how to actually do earth pony magic. You're the pony I want to have teach me about that. Arkenstone's hooves had worked their way down to her haunches now, gently massaging her cutie marks. Had it been any pony but her colt friend, or a professional masseuse, Twilight would have declared that said pony was being much too forward. However, the fact that it was Arkenstone's hooves on her haunches only made her quiver pleasantly. Are you sure you want me to teach you? He asked in a sly tone. I'd have thought that your friends, maybe Applejack or Pinkie Pie. It took a little bit of coaxing to wake up the muscles that Arkenstone's treatment had thoroughly relaxed, but Twilight managed it, rolling over, throwing Arkenstone's hooves off of her hindquarters as she did so. The stallion was too well balanced to be knocked over by the motion, so he came to rest with his hooves on either side of her as Twilight rolled onto her back beneath him, her violet eyes glaring playfully up at his closed lids. I want you, she replied, her voice emerging as a husky purr. I want to stay with you and learn from you. Her forelegs found their way around his neck, slowly pulling Arkenstone down towards her. Is that an order from my princess then? Asked Arkenstone. Twilight paused, suddenly lost in thought for a brief moment. That's right, I'm a princess now, she realized. That means you're my knight too. I've always been your knight, replied Arkenstone. Celestia may be my liege, but you are the lady who rules my heart. If I'm your lady, then I suppose I'll need to give you a token of my affection, said Twilight, pulling Arkenstone down towards her again. I gladly accept it, said Arkenstone, his breath tickling Twilight's lips before they connected with his. They held each other tightly, moaning as they kissed deeply and passionately, their tongues dancing and mingling, hooves wandering. Neither of them noticed the door open, nor the click of claws on the floor as a certain dragon came into the room. Oh come on, shouted Spike, throwing up his hands in exasperation, save it for the bedroom, you two. The pair jumped apart like startled deer, Twilight squeaking in surprise as Arkenstone actually tumbled off the couch. Spike, she scolded sharply, you shouldn't just barge in on ponies like that. You shouldn't be having a heavy makeout session right in front of the only door to the rest of the palace, retorted Spike sourly. I hope you two remember that the library is a public building during business hours, or you're gonna be arrested for public indecency if you get carried away on the main floor and some pony walks in on you. Twilight looked over at Arkenstone and saw his shoulders quaking. It's not funny, she grumbled. Arkenstone managed to contain his mirth before smiling at Twilight. But he has a point, he said. Letting out a sigh, Twilight did her best to calm down and relax. She was flustered, but the one who'd walked in on her and Arkenstone was family at least. It could have been worse. She had to concede that Arkenstone was right about Spike being right. The young dragon did have a point. Now, if you'll excuse me, said Spike, not waiting for her reply, I'm gonna go see about what's for dinner. He gave Twilight a smirk as he headed for the door. If you two end up going all the way on that couch, I'm gonna torch it before I sit on it again. Spike, protested Twilight, going red again. The little dragon was out the door and gone before she could scold him properly. Beside her, Arkenstone laughed heartily, not even stopping when her extended wing swatted him on the back of the head. Now, I expect all of you to be on your best behavior, said Fluttershy sternly as she looked out over her animal friends. Sparkler promised me that she would come and feed you every day, since she's staying behind anyway. I don't want to hear that any of you gave her any trouble. Do you understand? The animals around her nodded vigorously. Standing at Fluttershy's hooves, Angel Bunny surveyed them with folded arms and a stern glare, like a general looking over his troops, clearly intent on doing his part to keep them in line. Looks like you've got everything in hoof over here, joked Caramel as he came down from their bedroom, the few belongings they needed for the trip back to Canterlot packed in the saddlebags slung over his back. Smiling, Fluttershy nodded at the animals, signaling that they were free to disperse as she turned to exchange a nuzzle with her colt friend. Is Don packed? He had everything ready to go this morning before he left for school, replied Caramel. His saddlebags are in his room. We can take them when we go to pick him up. How long until we leave? Asked Fluttershy. Our train leaves about an hour after we get done, replied Caramel, so we've got a little time yet. To illustrate his point, he set the saddlebags aside on the living room table. Fluttershy sidled up next to him and began to nuzzle under his chin. Caramel reciprocated, leaning against her before slowly wrapping a foreleg around her shoulders and pulling her up against him. Fluttershy turned her head up to face his, while Caramel turned his face downwards to bring their lips together in a lingering kiss. I'm glad you made it home, he said softly as Fluttershy's affections moved down to his neck. I'm glad too, she said in reply. By the way, have you told Don yet? Fluttershy paused, her smile faltering. Not yet, she replied. I figured I'd wait until the time is right. If you wait too long, he won't have to be told to figure it out, replied Caramel. I know, said Fluttershy with a giggle, but I know when I want to tell him. It's not too far away. Oh, said Caramel, grinning slyly, you're waiting for that, huh? That's right, cooed Fluttershy, I thought it might make for a wonderful birthday present. It'll certainly be a surprise for him, I'm sure, said Caramel with a chuckle. Are you ready for the trip to Canterlot? Asked Scootaloo eagerly, bouncing on her hooves as she and the others headed out for recess. Despite the fact that all of Ponyville had been invited for the coronation and the associated celebration, Cheerilee had said that it was no excuse to curtail lessons until it was time to leave. Students who protested were told that she could simply treat the whole affair as a school trip complete with an extensive lecture about Princess Celestia's 1,000-year tenure as sole princess of Equestria while the adults partied, which quickly silenced those protests. Don didn't mind all that much, having come to enjoy school and only wishing that he hadn't ended up skipping out on it so often. Luckily, the damage done by his fight with Whiteshade had been fairly easy to heal, otherwise he might have missed more of it while he recovered. I packed before I headed out this morning, said Don, surveying the new schoolyard. Reconstruction was nearly complete and only the school's bell tower still needed to be finished. It had been deemed complete enough that Cheerilee could move her students back into a proper classroom, rather than a tent out in the fields. All around town, ponies were moving back into newly restored or reconstructed homes, many of them better than before thanks to a fresh injection of bits from the Royal Relief Fund, as Celestia had come to refer to the monetary assets she had seized from the rebellious members of the noble court. I'm so excited, squealed Sweetie Belle, it's like going up for hearts warming all over again and we get to have a princess of our very own. The rest of the Cutie Mark Crusaders stifled snorts at the sound of Sweetie describing Twilight as though she were a pet cat Celestia had bought for the town. Blushing at her outburst, Sweetie hunkered down in embarrassment but relaxed as Rumble draped a wing across her back. Looking over, Don noticed that Apple Bloom was uncharacteristically silent. Is something wrong? He asked. You look pale. Though she'd found a bit of humorous relief in Sweetie's outburst, Bloom had quickly waxed back into a melancholy mood as she stared at the ground. I'm scared, she said. Of what? Asked an incredulous Scootaloo, gaping openly at her friend. The bad guy had been stopped, the world had been saved. Even the cult Solar and those stupid nobles had been scratched off the to-do list. What else was there to be afraid of? It's just that, ya know, what if we ain't getting a new princess? Huh, now all of Bloom's friends were staring at her incredulously. I mean, what if Twilight can't come back to Ponyville? Asked Bloom nervously. What if she has to stay in Canterlot to do her princess stuff? What if? Scootaloo blinked and put the pieces together. Oh, she said softly, I get it. What if Spike has to stay up in Canterlot too? Bloom nodded. I wouldn't worry, said Rumble. Twilight's so happy here that I don't think she'd stay in Canterlot even if they tried to make her. He thought over his words for a second. Not that I think that any pony is going to try and keep her in Canterlot. Certainly not Princess Celestia, Don pointed out. Even if she does stay there, do you think Spike would? Added Sweetie Belle, he loves it in Ponyville. I guess you're right, said Bloom with a sigh. Y'all must think I'm such a silly pony fair worryin' about something like that. Scootaloo thought about all the times Don had gone off on some life-risking endeavor, those nights spent wondering if he would come back alive or in one piece. Nah, I don't think so, she said. I can understand being scared that your special Sumpony or some dragon might not come back. Don wrapped his wing around Scootaloo's back and pulled her up against his side so that he could nuzzle her cheek. I'm sorry, he whispered. Hey, she said with a giggle, it's okay. You've always had good reasons for doing it. I'm just glad it's all over. Maybe not, said Don with a shrug. I somehow doubt that things will ever be that peaceful. You're probably right, said Scootaloo, but who knows, the next time you end up going off on some adventure, maybe I'll be able to come with you. Maybe you will, Don agreed as he nuzzled her mane. I don't know what are worried about, said Bloom. I mean, that cult and those nobles ain't a problem anymore. Perhaps not, agreed Don, but I wouldn't count on everything being over. Besides, who knows when a crisis of a different kind will require my attention. Are you planning on being some kind of superhero? Inquired Sweetie, canting her head. Thinking about Arkenstone and Spitfire and the hopes they had for him, Don pursed his lips. Something like that. Once school had gotten out for the day, the Crusaders joined their respective families for the train trip to Canterlot. During the course of the journey, they chattered excitedly, forced Don to recount the story of the battles throughout the palace, and asked Twilight's fellow element bearers about their part in the whole affair. They played games, shared snacks, and generally did what they could to while away the hours until they reached Canterlot. They arrived to find the city bustling with activity. The residents of Ponyville had been the only non-Canterlotian ponies invited to the coronation and the celebration afterwards en masse, but invitations had gone off to other important ponies throughout the nation. On top of that, the news that a new princess had emerged from the chaos that had engulfed Canterlot had already spread across Equestria, and every pony who could manage the journey was streaming into the capital to see the coronation themselves. Fortunately, there was plenty of lodging available, luxury accommodations even, as Celestia and her organizers were happy to house ponies in the manors and mansions that formerly belonged to the noble court which were now crown property until further notice. Naturally, Twilight's closest friends and their families, along with a few select others, were invited to stay in the palace now that repairs had opened up the guest quarters, fortunately mostly undamaged during the conflict. As soon as they got off the train, Shining Armor and Cadence, along with a detachment of the royal guard, whisked them away through the crowds to the palace, expertly parting the way through the sea of ponies. "How are you doing?" asked Shining as he fell back to walk alongside Dawn. "Fine," replied the Colt, "I've already recovered my magic and none of my injuries hurt anymore." "Good to hear," said Shining, "you fought well. I know I don't really have to say it, but I wanted you to know." "Thank you," said Dawn, his cheeks coloring a little at Shining's praise. "I was glad that I was able to help in the end. I was afraid that the fight against White Shade, or Morning Star, would be far beyond my comprehension and I would be forced to simply stand aside and watch while some pony else tried to save the world. That's how I feel every time Twilight and her friends have to go off and save us from world-threatening evils," said Shining, bobbing his head in acknowledgement to Fluttershy, who was trotting alongside her son. "I think it's how your mother feels whenever you have to go off somewhere too." Fluttershy didn't say anything, but she did nod in agreement with Shining's words. He chuckled dryly. "In your case, you shouldn't have to try to shoulder everything on your own. You're still a kid after all. I was captain of the royal guard, so I have less of an excuse." "Was?" Don's eyes widened as he looked up at Shining. "Yep," replied Shining, "as of yesterday afternoon, I officially retired. Flash Sentry is taking over as the new captain. You're officially speaking to the Prince Consort of the Crystal Empire now. Once this whole mess is over, Cadence and I are moving to the Crystal Empire permanently." "Congratulations," said Don, before pausing to consider his words, "that is, if congratulations are the proper response to this. I'm not sure how you feel about giving up your place as captain." Shining shrugged. "On one hoof, I am kinda sore about it. It was pretty much written in stone after the thrashing Perlin gave us at the train station last year. I've just been holding on to the spot till now because it's a bad idea to switch leaders in the middle of a crisis unless said leader is completely incompetent, which I am not, no matter what some ponies might say. On the other hoof, I'm glad to be out of it. The noble court might be a thing of the past, but being captain means you still have to deal with all kinds of political jockeying from other ponies, not to mention the other branches of the guard. On top of that, you get to be that special pony who soaks up most of the blame when things go wrong. Don't get me wrong, I loved the job and I was proud to do my duty, but I'm glad to be out of it. Flash Sentry will do a good job. I know that much." They had reached the palace by this point. Servants were waiting there to take charge of their luggage and deliver it to their quarters. In the meantime, Shining began to lead them down a set of hallways that Don had become rather familiar with in his last visit. "Why are we heading to the throne room?" he asked. "Well, the coronation is for the benefit of every pony," said Shining. "Princess Celestia pretty much has to have it if Twilight's gonna officially be made princess. But that's pretty much the only thing the coronation is for. Princess Celestia has a few other things she wants to wrap up before we get on with the big show." Twilight shifted nervously as she waited on the dais. Shiny should be back with the others any moment now. "Are you really that worried?" asked Arkenstone, who stood beside her. "It's not as though it's a public ceremony." "I know," said Twilight, "but I can't help but feel that this is where the really important stuff is going to happen, especially." She looked over at their guest, who waited quietly between Spitfire and Firefly, both mares keeping one eye each constantly trained on him. They stood at the foot of the dais, also watching the doors out of the throne room. "Also," added Twilight, shifted her eyes sideways to look at the broad, couch-like throne that Celestia was lounging on. "I can't get used to the change in decor." Celestia tittered. "What?" she asked. "I can't change my throne. It always struck me as silly. Every time I want to change things up in here, ponies act as though I'm undermining some kind of sacred tradition, as though I haven't changed my throne at least 5 times in the last 1,000 years. But you're the only one who would actually remember that," Twilight thought in her most deadpan mental voice. "Besides," continued Celestia, "I think it's only natural to have some say in where I rest my rump for 6 hours out of nearly every day." Luna, who stood on the throne's other side, giggled. "All that resting of your rump and consuming of cakes is playing havoc with your figure, dear sister." "Luna," protested Celestia. "I disagree," said Arkenstone with a yawn. "I find your figure to be as captivating as it was the first day we met." "Very funny," said Celestia, completely unfazed by the joke, as even Twilight stifled a giggle. The doors swung open to admit their guests. Shining Armor and Cadence were the first ones into the room, followed by Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack, along with the Cutie Mark Crusaders. Behind them came the members of the Apple family, including Ditzy and Dinky, along with Thunderlane, Cloud Chaser, and Flitter. Red River and Stormfront accompanied them as well. Apple Bloom's eye surveyed the vast room, taking in everything, until they came to rest on a young, purple dragon who was sitting at the foot of the dais. "Spike," she shouted, rushing forward. "Hey," Spike shouted back, smiling and opening his arms as he braced himself with his tail. It was a good thing he did, otherwise he would have been bowled over when Bloom tackled him in an enthusiastic hug. "Apple Bloom," scolded Applejack, "ya can't do that in front, oh the princess." Celestia laughed. "I don't mind, Applejack. This wasn't meant to be a fully formal affair. There's no need to worry." She smiled fondly at the little dragon she had once helped to raise as he hugged his filly friend, his wings fluttering with barely contained excitement. "Besides, we need to wait for one more pony before we start. She should be here any." "I made it," shouted Rainbow Dash, coming in for a landing just outside the doors. In the process, she actually skidded across the polished floors and out of sight before she managed to abate her momentum and double back at a gallop, wisely not trying to take flight again as she bounded into the room. "Am I late? Did I miss anything?" "You're just in time," said Celestia. She looked to the 2 members of the royal guard who flanked either side of the entrance and nodded at them. The 2 guards began to swing the massive, newly carved doors shut, leaving Celestia and her audience alone. "Now then," said Celestia, "we're ready to begin. There are several matters to address before we carry on with the preparations for Twilight's coronation. This is a relatively informal ceremony, but it is no less official. First off, I'll start with the awards." "Awards?" asked Fluttershy, her eyes going wide. Celestia nodded at Fluttershy. Yes, after all, there are ponies here whose deeds we need to honor and recognize. However, I am aware that none of you are keen to endure the public scrutiny that would accompany a public ceremony, so I'm keeping this a private affair. First things first. Stormfront, Red River, please step forward. The two mercenary stallions did as they were bid, slipping past the others in their group to stand in front of the dais, bowing low before Celestia, who nodded to them, silently bidding them to rise. The two of you put your lives on the line in facing Terra Hart, a skilled practitioner of the mountain route and a truly superior opponent. You went above and beyond the requirements of your assignment and endured injuries that you will carry with you for the remainder of your lives. For your service, I am honoring you both with the Silver Star for distinguished service. Beside her, Luna lifted up a small, elegantly decorated box in her magic and opened it. Inside were a pair of star-shaped medals cast in silver, hanging from gray ribbons. Celestia's magic plucked the medals out of their resting places and floated them down to Red and Storm, draping the ribbons around their necks. It is an honor, said Red as he and Storm bowed to the royal sisters. The Silver Star was an award for military achievements for ponies who risked their lives in combat in the service of others, particularly in the process of protecting other ponies. It was generally awarded to members of the Guard. Red and Storm, who had been under Shining Armor's employ when they had gone to Ponyville, technically satisfied the requirements for the award. Also, continued Celestia, I understand that you have both given up your mercenary work. While I am pleased that you've managed to find new employment, I still wish to provide you with a modest pension as a thanks for your service. The stallions bowed again and retreated. Next, said Celestia, Scootaloo and Rumble, come forward. The aforementioned foals exchanged a nervous glance. Rumble, clad in his pale green shirt, was gently nudged forward by Flitter. Scootaloo, who was wearing her shimmer silk scarf, was getting the same treatment from her mother and Rainbow Dash. The two of them stopped at the throne, briefly at a loss for what to do, before deciding to imitate Red and Storm. They bowed awkwardly. In all honesty, you don't need to do that, said Celestia, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. After all, I want to thank you for what you've done as well. Though you are both young and inexperienced, you nonetheless did what you felt was necessary to help the ponies you cared about, even though doing so put you at tremendous risk of life and limb. You faced down foes that many adult ponies would have balked at and helped Arkenstone to successfully rescue Twilight, as well as dismantle Baron Elderflower's plot to undermine our nation. Arkenstone has told me that he might not have succeeded had the two of you not been there to help him, and two very dangerous ponies are in our custody thanks to your work. The two young Pegasi blushed profusely at the praise Celestia was heaping on them. But we still got grounded for it, Scootaloo muttered rebelliously, earning a snort of laughter from her mother. Though Celestia's smile twitched, just barely avoiding breaking into a full grin, she continued serenely. In honor of your efforts and in recognition of your achievement, I will be granting you the second most distinguished medal available to civilians. I hereby present to you both the Half Moon Medal of Merit. The Moon series of medals had been created by Celestia and Luna shortly after the latter's return from the moon. The medals were silver and cast in the shape of the moon during 3 of its most prominent phases, the prestige of the medal matching the amount of the moon displayed. First came the crescent moon, followed by the half moon, and finally, the full moon, which had yet to be awarded even once since the awards had been created. Now Luna held up the same box as before. But this time, when it opened, the 2 half-moon-shaped medals rested where the silver stars once had. They hung from a pair of deep blue ribbons as Celestia lifted them out of the box and levitated them down to Scootaloo and Rumble, hanging them from their necks. Though Celestia had dismissed the need for formality, they nonetheless bowed before scampering back to their families, where they were met with hugs, nuzzles, and proud expressions. Next up, said Celestia, continuing on with the proceedings, Dame Fluttershy, Dame Rarity, Dame Applejack, Dame Pinkie Pie, and Dame Rainbow Dash, please approach. The 5 girls came forward, trading looks as they arrayed themselves at the foot of the dais. At a nod from Twilight, they stood proud and tall, recognizing that there was no need for them to bow. Twilight herself trotted down the dais to stand with them. Once again, said Celestia, looking them over, I find myself in your debt. The 6 of you have saved Equestria yet again. Twilight has her alicorn hood, but I want to reward the rest of you as well. She sighed. After you saved us all from discord, I knighted you, believing that it was an appropriate way to honor your actions. After dealing with the machinations of the noble court, I now realize that I may have done you a disservice by doing so. This time, I have decided to honor you the same way that Luna and I honor our knights when they perform a great service to us. I hereby grant you a royal boon, a favor you are free to ask of me or my sister. It will always be available, so there is no need for you to use it now. All you need do is ask, and if it is within our power and within reason, it shall be granted to you. Wow, said Applejack, taking off her Stetson and holding it to her chest, a favor from the princess herself. Though I speak somewhat presumptuously, I advise you not to use it frivolously, counseled Luna. The element bearers nodded at her and fell back, with Twilight returning to the dais to stand between Arkenstone and Celestia. Now then, said Celestia, I ask that Flaxseed come forward. Flaxseed had been hiding at the back of the group. Only when Rarity stepped back and gently nudged him did he proceed to move forward. She accompanied him, holding slightly back and pressing her shoulder against his barrel to help comfort him. Flaxseed gazed nervously up at Celestia before flicking his eyes over to Luna, who gave him a smile and an encouraging nod. Though he was shaking with nerves, his eyes remained their normal, almond hue as he waited for Celestia to speak. She considered him silently for a moment, her smile fading into a sad, apologetic look. You have endured great hardship and suffered for many years. You bear scars upon both your body and heart that will never fully heal, and the memories of your experiences shall always be with you. Worse still, it was done by ponies who claimed to act in my name, who believed they were executing my will. That they acted in willful ignorance of my true feelings and that I have publicly expressed disapproval of their actions does not change that. You suffered as a consequence of my negligence and my unwillingness to act. For that, I apologize. She lowered her head until it hung below the level of her throne, closing her eyes. I don't really feel that it's why your fault, princess, said Flaxseed. You can't be everywhere and some ponies will never change their minds. I suffered, but though it may be indirectly because of my hardships, I ended up finding happiness as well. He looked back to smile at Rarity, who smiled back and nuzzled against his neck. I am glad, said Celestia, her smile returning. She raised her head. Nonetheless, your forbearance deserves recognition. For that, I award you the crescent moon of merit. And one other thing. From her side, Celestia levitated a rolled-up parchment and floated it down towards Flaxseed. When it reached him, the parchment unrolled, allowing Flaxseed to see what it contained. This is a royal certification for accounting, the equivalent to a diploma from any trade school in Equestria with regards to your chosen profession. You are hereby officially licensed as an accountant and free to work where you please. Tears streamed down Flaxseed's face. It was clear that he appreciated this gift even more than the medal that Luna draped from his neck. Rarity smiled and leaned against him, remembering that one of Flaxseed's greatest regrets was that his fugitive status had kept him from being able to attend trade school and become a real accountant, despite the fact that she had seen firsthand that he had the necessary skill to be one. Thank you so much, Your Majesty, said Flaxseed, his voice nearly a whisper. I must thank you for enduring so long, said Celestia equally softly, you've earned this. Dipping his head politely and taking the certification in his magic, Flaxseed and Rarity made their way back to the group. There is one last award to be given out, said Celestia. Dawn Lightwing, come forth. Dawn walked up to stand at the base to dais, looking expectantly up at Celestia, who smiled warmly down at him. Dawn, like Flaxseed, you have endured a great deal of hardship over the course of your life. Once again, much of it was done in my name and as a consequence of my own negligence. My apologies will never make up for what you have endured and I can't give back the time you've lost because of it. She sighed. Princess, said Dawn, you know that I do not hold you responsible for what I suffered. Though I may have endured great pain and hardship, I did emerge stronger because of it. And, because one of the ponies you favored kindly took me and offered me a home, a family, and her love. I am happier than I would have ever thought possible. I do not regard the time I spent on the run as a waste. I'm glad, said Celestia. On top of that, you have performed great services for your friends and this nation, not merely once but several times. You helped to free Cloudsdale from the grip of a tribalist insurrection that might have caused severe bloodshed. You traveled far from home to rescue a mare trapped in the stronghold of one of the members of the noble court. You faced down assassins like Willow, Shadesteel, and Terraheart, protecting your friends and family as you did so. Finally, you were the one who struck the decisive blow against Whiteshade, which allowed us to win the day and finally put an end to his schemes once and for all. All of Equestria know, the entire world owes you a great debt. Dawn lowered his head, vibrant spots of red standing out on his cheeks as she spoke. Bashfully, he scraped a forehoof against the floor, trying not to look up at Princess Celestia anymore. Well, behind him, he could hear his friends and even his mother giggling at his embarrassment. Even Celestia was trying to hide her growing smile behind her hoof. It took her a moment, but she managed to get her expression back under control. In honor of your achievements and the great service you have provided, it is my pleasure to present to you the Full Moon Medal of Merit. A gasp escaped the ponies behind him and even from Twilight at her place by Celestia's throne. Luna held up the box once again and opened it, revealing the silver disc of a full moon hanging from a dark purple ribbon. Celestia levitated it down and draped the ribbon over Dawn's neck. When Dawn bowed his head to her, Celestia lifted a hoof, stopping him before he could go back to the group. There is more, she said. I have consulted with my knights and learned the details of your battles. They have not failed to notice the progress you have made. Thus, it is my pleasure to honor you as a full master of the Gale King, the first so recognized in over a century. Dawn froze in place, his eyes wide, gaping in shock. I can't be a master, he protested. I'm not anywhere near good enough. I still have so much left to learn. Indeed, said Arkenstone with a chuckle. Did you think that you ever wouldn't have more to learn? True mastery is the realization that you never stop learning, never stop growing. You've shown that you understand this even better than ponies several times your own age. From where she was standing, Spitfire spoke up. What you have accomplished is leagues beyond even what your master was capable of. Don't go selling yourself short, kiddo. It is my understanding, said Celestia, that many of my current knights have their eyes on you as a future member of their order. Do you have any intention of joining? I may, said Dawn, but not yet. I would like to spend my time as a foal, and as a son, a little longer. As is your right, said Celestia, you will join them when you are ready. I look forward to that day. Dawn bowed again and turned to head back to his mother's side. This time, Celestia said and did nothing to stop him. Now then, said Celestia, the pleasant part of this affair is over. It is time to turn our attention to the less pleasant duties. She nodded to Shining and Cadence. For this, I require the input of just a few of you, so Shining and Cadence will see the rest of you to your quarters. According to her instructions, the element bearers remained, along with Dawn. The rest of the group was escorted out, leaving them alone with Celestia, Luna, their knights, and Perlin Bluestreak. Perlin Bluestreak, please come forward. For Perlin, it was technically less coming forward than coming in from the side as he walked to the red carpet that had been laid over the floor to stand before the dais and directly below Celestia's throne, looking up at her as she looked down at him. There was no warm, caring smile gracing her features now. There was only the stern look of a ruler about to dispense judgment. Regarding your current fate, I have not yet made a final decision, said Celestia. The reason I have not yet issued your sentence is because I wish to take the testimony of the ponies who came here today, so that I might have what I need to come to a final decision. As it stands, you have committed severe crimes against Equestria. You have aided, abetted, and participated in treasonous activities in numerous locales. The list of your crimes is extensive and there is much hardship that might have been avoided had you not been there. Perlin bowed his head as Celestia spoke, plainly accepting her words. However, continued Celestia, I have come to understand that your circumstances are complex and that you are not wholly beyond redemption. Well, asked Celestia, looking to Twilight, what do you think? Twilight examined Perlin through the sheet of one-way glass that divided him from them. Cadence was in the room with him, the two of them talking quietly, though their voices could be heard clearly by the two ponies listening in. I can dismantle the dark matter his wings are made of, said Twilight, but I can't restore his original wings. In a sense, those are long gone. Their structure and that of the bones and muscles they've been attached to has been altered too much, first by giving him wings of mithril, then by giving him his current set. Maybe I could manage something of an approximation, but I'd probably end up doing more harm than good. I'm not a doctor of Pegasus biology after all. I see, said Celestia glumly. I had hoped that, at the very least, being able to render him relatively harmless by divesting him of his main weapons would be an option. That would make it less necessary to resort to extreme methods. Well, I could simply aim for a form of dark matter that's more inert and couldn't be weaponized the way his current wings can't, said Twilight, tapping her chin, but it would take me a little while to come up with something. It's better than nothing, said Celestia. I don't think you should do that, said a pony in a quiet voice, almost a whisper from behind the two princesses. Turning around, they saw Coco Pommel standing there, watching them as they discussed Perlin's fate. She had faded into the background so naturally that they'd momentarily forgotten she was there at all. Why would you say that? Asked Celestia as she watched Coco carefully. The young mare shied away from being under the gaze of Princess Celestia at first, but then managed to rally and state her case. I think Perlin's wings are too important to him. He chose those wings, not like his last ones. You mean the mithril ones, right? Asked Twilight. Coco nodded in response. His father wanted to make him a weapon. He wanted Perlin to kill you someday. She looked specifically at Celestia as she said that. Quote. Perlin decided he didn't want to and killed his father, but he didn't really know how to live after that, so he did the only thing he'd been raised to. He fought, said Twilight, frowning and looking at Perlin through the glass again. It was the same story she'd heard from Rainbow Dash. Rainbow had phrased it differently, that Perlin was a mercenary largely for his own amusement, that he cared little for killing or dying, so long as he had the chance to put his skills to use. She hadn't really looked at it from the angle Coco was using. Perlin fought because that had been what he'd been raised to do. He hadn't been raised to tell right from wrong or about the reasons behind conflict. He'd taken control of his own life when he'd killed his father. But then he'd immediately defaulted back to the one thing he knew how to do above all else. Celestia sighed. I wish that reassured me. However, it makes me fear that, regardless of what we do, Perlin will be a threat to himself and others. I think he can change, said Coco, speaking more loudly this time. He already is changing. He just needs to be taught a better way, something better to use his wings for. I agree with Coco, said Cadence, making Twilight jump. She hadn't even realized that Cadence had left the interrogation room. Perlin was still sitting there, idly tapping a forehoof against the table as he stared at the window. The sight of his hawk-like eyes, seemingly watching her, despite the fact that Twilight knew he couldn't see through the glass, made her shiver. You do, said Celestia. Cadence nodded. Perlin's beginning to understand what he's done better, and I think that Coco is helping him understand that he needs to change the way he lives his life. What's more, taking his wings away, or even rendering them harmless, would do irreparable damage to him. Whether mithril or dark matter, they are too integral to Perlin's sense of identity for him to come through losing them unscathed. So you believe that he can be trusted to change for the better? Asked Celestia. I do, said Cadence before she smiled at Coco, and it's entirely thanks to you. Me, gasped Coco, blushing furiously. Cadence nodded and giggled. When he realized that he cared about you and that he wanted you to be happy, that's when he started to question the way he'd been living. So long as he has his feelings for you, I think we can keep him from going astray. What do you recommend then? Asked Celestia. Well, Cadence tapped her chin thoughtfully. Thus, I have decided that you will atone for your crimes through service, said Princess Celestia. After recalling that past conversation, she had listened to the stories of the ponies who had encountered Perlin personally. She'd listened to Rainbow Dash and Rarity recall their experiences and then heard Dawn's account of the encounters he'd had with Perlin. Service. Perlin tilted his head. You mean community service? Am I going to be spending my time picking up litter in the park or something? Nothing so tame as that, said Celestia, maintaining her stern tone, though a faint twitch of her lips betrayed her amusement at his words. You will be sent out as an agent of the crown to settle problems that the royal guard cannot handle. So, like your knights then? Inquired Perlin. Somewhat, said Celestia. You will not have the authority or the autonomy that they do, and you will be carefully observed to ensure that you are performing your duties properly. Make no mistake, I have no intention of using you as an assassin or a mere blunt instrument. You will be required to avoid using lethal force to the fullest extent of your ability, and if I am ever led to believe that you did not do everything in your power to avoid killing in a situation, then I will have Twilight render your wings harmless. Perlin bowed his head. This is not a permanent arrangement, said Celestia, giving the young stallion the first smile she'd ever shown him. When Luna and I have ascertained that you have properly atoned for your crimes, you will be free to leave our service. It will be up to you, then, to decide what you wish to do with your life. However, I hope that you will have a better understanding of what you would like to do. Perlin bowed his head in acknowledgement. Turning to the rest of her audience, Celestia asked, does any pony have anything to say about this? Do you agree with this judgment? It doesn't seem like such a bad arrangement, said Dawn, smirking slightly as he came up to stand next to Perlin. At least you will still have opportunities and reasons to fight. Yes, but, Perlin looked over at Dawn, who merely smiled at him. If you find the right reasons to put your skills to use, I think she will have fewer problems, said Dawn before he lowered his head so that he could look around Perlin and his guards. Isn't that right, Coco? Coco Pommel hesitantly stepped out from behind the base of a shattered column she'd been hiding behind. Why yes, she said very quietly, a small smile on her face. As Perlin turned to face her, Spitfire, Firefly, and Dawn stepped away so that Coco could walk up to him. She raised a hoof and gently pressed it to his cheek. I think it would be good for you. I never wanted to take away something so important to who you are. Perlin leaned into her touch, pressing up against her hoof. I don't want to frighten you though, he said. You're afraid. I am, said Coco, but if you learn to use your wings the right way, I don't think I'll have anything to fear anymore. She moved in a little closer. When you're ready, come to Ponyville. Leaning in, she planted a quick kiss on his lips. I'll wait for you there. Okay, said Perlin. The two of them moved forward enough that they could press their necks up against each other. Perlin's wings unfolded and slowly moved forward to brush over Coco's back. She twitched at the contact at first, prompting Perlin to pull his wings back. No, she whispered into his ear, it's okay. Finally, Perlin's wings wrapped around her and held her a little tighter. Well, said Dawn with a satisfied smile as he moved to trade nuzzles with his mother, that's about as happy an ending as we can manage. I agree, said Fluttershy, smiling as she watched Perlin and Coco hold one another. Celestia let out a relieved sigh as she closed the door to her room behind her. Her horn glowed, her magic already hard at work unfastening the pieces of her regalia and setting them aside. The little award ceremony was really that stressful, huh? Teased a voice from a pile of cushions over by the fireplace. It went well enough, said Celestia. I'm just glad that there were no objections to Perlin's sentence. Swift's stride stretched, and winced with a grunt as he tried to settle into a position more comfortable than the one he was already in. For once, his black garment and white sash were nowhere to be seen. It was to his benefit that only Celestia could see him now, as his body looked like one massive bruise, mottled shades of purple, blue, and black beneath the hairs of his coat. Fortunately, the healers had said that he would make a full recovery, eventually. Their healing magic had been stymied by Swift's own magic, which he was using to literally hold his body together at almost a cellular level. Whiteshade's salvo of magical attacks had injured him in ways that the doctors couldn't even properly diagnose, and this was the only way that Swift was able to ensure that he would recover without any complications. Making her way to the fireplace, Celestia summoned a couple of mugs and began to prepare some hot chocolate for the both of them. She was happy to have Swift spend his recovery in her room, where she could keep an eye on him herself. I'm sorry, by the way, said Swift as he gingerly took the proffered mug in his hooves. You apologized before you even put your plan in motion, Celestia pointed out, and it worked out nearly perfectly. She sighed and shook her head. Though true to your words, I was not happy about it. I am glad that you did not lie to me. I never could, admitted Swift with a shrug, and I never want to. There is something I am curious about, said Celestia. If I had forbidden it, would you have still tried to kill Twilight? Yep, said Swift without the slightest inkling of hesitation. Even if it meant losing your knighthood for real and suffering the consequences of my wrath. Pressed Celestia. Swift's squinty eyes opened wide enough for Celestia to see his ice blue irises as he gave her a completely sober look. I still would have done what I did. I also would have accepted the consequences afterwards. For a long moment, the silence hovered between them. They both took the opportunity to get in a few sips of their cocoa before Celestia sighed. Thank you, she said. Swift chuckled. We do crazy things for the ones we love, though I think I'm gonna steer clear of Arkenstone for a while. I get the feeling he's still pretty sore with me. That would probably be wise, said Celestia with a giggle of her own. Naturally, I've restored your full status as a knight, though I think I'll hold off the official announcement of that fact for a little while yet. I do believe Arkenstone realized what you were up to, though. You think that's gonna convince him to hold back? Asked Swift. If I were in his position, I probably wouldn't. No need to cause him any more stress. For now, I think it's enough for him to know that I won't be threatening his filly friend again. That is true, agreed Celestia. She smiled warmly at Swift. If you don't mind, said Swift, giving Celestia a strangely serious look, I have a question of my own. And what is that? Asked Celestia. Does Twilight Sparkle know that you knew what I was going to do? Asked Swift, his eyes widening out of their habitual squint. I think she may have surmised that I was in on your little trick, said Celestia. But I do not know for certain. She has not asked. If she asks, what will you do? Celestia stared pensively down into her mug. I will tell her the truth. I will answer her honestly and accept the consequences just as you would have had you chosen to act without my approval. I have hope that she understands what you did, even if she does not like or approve of it, and, in turn, understands why I trusted you to act as you did. But if she chooses not to, that is her right, and I couldn't necessarily say that she is wrong. Celestia looked up from her mug and smiled at Swift. For now, just rest and focus on getting better. I know that it is going to take you a while, and I don't want you going anywhere until you've fully recovered. She giggled yet again. If anything, I suppose I should be grateful to Whiteshade for the chance to keep you here for a decent period of time. Swift chuckled and raised his mug to her in a salute. All things considered, there's no place I would rather be. Twilight Sparkle's coronation was about as loud and flashy as such an event could be expected to be. By the time it started, ponies had flocked over from across all of Equestria to see the country's newest princess with their own eyes. On top of that, delegations from foreign nations, from Saddle Arabia, Minos, Pachydermia, Yakyakistan, Guaxia, and even a few Griffonaries, attended as well. Ponies lined the streets as Twilight was paraded through them on an elaborate carriage. She did her level best to remain calm, keep a polite grin on her face, and wave to the ponies cheering for her as she passed. Though her actual actions during the ceremony were minimal, nothing could fully convince Twilight that she wouldn't embarrass herself or Celestia and Luna in some way. Fortunately, she had not been required to make a flyby, or she was fairly certain that the only direction she might have ended up flying was down. Rainbow Dash had been coaching her, but Twilight figured it would be a few weeks before she felt confident enough to put on a public display. If any pony took issue with Twilight's rise, they were apparently unable to make themselves heard over the cheers of every pony else. Twilight's eyes had roved over the crowd, and though she'd seen a fair few jealous or underwhelmed ponies, she hadn't seen any pony glaring at her with outright hatred or resentment, which made her feel a little better. Luckily, the reception afterwards was a more intimate and private affair, for a given definition of intimate and private. The guest list included nearly the entire population of Ponyville, along with a select list of ponies that had been approved by Twilight herself, ponies she could trust to handle interacting with her neighbors and friends without their noses turning skywards. Fortunately, she no longer had to worry about offending any pony from the noble court. The rest of the Canterlot elite consisted largely of wealthy business ponies and others from similar walks of life who Twilight didn't need to worry about offending. With all the guests being so familiar with her, Twilight felt free to cut loose and enjoy herself, indulging in all the activities a proper Pinkie Pie party provided. Even the ponies who weren't invited to the reception were still able to enjoy themselves. Celestia, Luna, Cadence, and Pinkie had made arrangements for all the ponies visiting the coronation. Booths and stalls lined the streets, offering all kinds of food or fun activities. The bars were open, offering special deals to celebrate Equestria's new princess. The restaurants were filled up. Canterlot was swept up in a festival of celebration. Naturally, the party ran on late into the night. As the sun set and the moon rose, the attendees found that Pinkie had another surprise for them, a fireworks show, accompanied by a performance from the Wonderbolts, including Rainbow Dash. Even after the performance ended, Pinkie's fireworks continued to fill the sky with light, color, and sound. However, some ponies had enjoyed themselves enough and decided to call it a night. One particular group of such ponies watched the last of the fireworks from a balcony in the palace guest quarters. It certainly is beautiful, said Fluttershy as she leaned up against Caramel. Beside them, Don had reared up to rest his forehooves on the balcony railing as the three of them watched the conclusion of Pinky's show. You can say that again, agreed Caramel. Pinky sure knows how to end things on a high note. Looking over, he saw that Fluttershy's eyelids were drooping. Don was in a similar condition. Neither of them was overly accustomed to late nights. Caramel himself wasn't much of a night owl either, but he at least had more experience than the other two. As she yawned, Fluttershy began to nuzzle against Caramel's neck, already looking forward to going to bed. She would have probably gone much sooner, but had decided to enjoy Pinky's fireworks to the end, both for the sake of her friend and because the noise would have kept her from getting much sleep while the fireworks were still going off. By the way, said Caramel, beginning to fidget a little, there's something I'd like to ask you. Yes, Fluttershy pulled away just enough to get a look at Caramel's face. The sight of those teal eyes, however sleepy they might have been, made Caramel's heartbeat accelerate. I've been thinking about this for a while, said Caramel nervously, ever since heart's warming. Both his and Fluttershy's cheeks colored as they recalled that night. I've never been so happy as I've been with you, both of you. He gave Don a meaningful look as Don's eyes, which glowed slightly in the low light, fixed on him. I've realized just how much I've loved living with you, being a family. I wanted to ask this for a while now. Caramel turned to face Fluttershy fully, producing a small box in his hoof. A sharp gasp escaped Fluttershy as she realized just what must be within that box. Fluttershy, will you marry me? Asked Caramel, opening the box to reveal a necklace, a horseshoe crafted from lapis lazuli, hanging from a gold chain. Fluttershy's hooves went to her mouth as she stared, wide-eyed, at the necklace, tears beginning to form. She hesitated for a second, glancing over her shoulder at Don, who smiled widely and nodded. Turning back to Caramel, she gave her answer. Yes. Grinning like a fool, Caramel lifted the necklace out of its box and draped it over Fluttershy's neck. As soon as his hooves lowered, Fluttershy threw her arms around him, pulling him close and kissing him passionately. Above them, the sky lit up once again as Pinky's show entered its finale. Don soon joined in the embrace and the three of them huddled together on the balcony, their weariness forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Author's notes. This chapter ended up being a lot longer than I'd intended when I started writing it. However, I didn't see any place where I really wanted to break it down. As the second to last chapter in the story, I figured that it wasn't that big of a deal. Next chapter, an epilogue. Epilogue. Chapter 37, Epilogue. Don stretched his wings, feeling the joints where they met his shoulders pop as he strained to spread his feathers out as far as he could. He reveled in the warmth of the late afternoon sun as it seeped into them. After a decent training session with Scootaloo, just basking in the sun helped relax his body and muscles. Even the cloud he was lying on felt blissfully warm. He only wished Scootaloo could be there to share it with him. But she seemed to have something she needed to take care of and had left as soon as they finished their training session. Since Twilight's coronation, every pony had returned to Ponyville. The days had taken on a peaceful, regular pattern. Don attended school with his friends, trained with Scootaloo in the morning and afternoon, worked at the tea shop on the weekends, spent the evening with his mother and father. Scootaloo's birthday, then her friends came and went, Don enjoying them thoroughly. Though he maintained his awareness and kept a watch for any sign of danger, there had been no problems from the remnants of the cult Solar or any pony affiliated with the noble court. Even having a new princess living in Ponyville hadn't changed things much. Aside from sporting a pair of wings, Twilight lived much the same way as she always had, though Arkenstone now lived in the library with her and Spike. These quiet and peaceful days were a welcome change from the past year of trials Don had gone through, to say nothing of the years before it. That year he had spent in the Everfree Forest and the years before, when he'd been on the run, moving from town to town to escape ponies hunting him, all seemed so much like distant dreams. The memories had a strange, unreal quality that unnerved him at times. It's amazing to think that things have changed so much, that I've changed so much. Don smiled at the thought. If things were radically different from how they were before, then he was grateful for the change. He was happy now. Though Scootaloo and the others still bothered him about crusading for his cutie mark, Don didn't feel any rush to fill the space on his flank just yet. Such things would come in their own time and he was content to wait until then. Arkenstone had already promised him a full-time position at the tea house when he graduated from school, though such an occasion was still a couple of years away. Checking the position of the sun, Don decided that, even though it was still early, he might as well head home. Normally, he and Scootaloo would hang out with their friends and fellow crusaders after school before parting ways for the day. But for some reason, every pony had something they needed to do or take care of right away. So he and Scootaloo had skipped straight to their training before she had needed to go off and do something as well. Even taking his time, Don still reached his home fairly early. He took a brief moment to look down on it from above as he circled in for a landing. Already, he could see the shadows of ponies and animals moving through the windows. Strange, it looks like there's more than just Mom and Dad. Are we having company over for dinner? Looking at the house next door, where the Griffin mercenaries who had previously been Fluttershy's bodyguards lived, he noted that the windows were dark and there was no sign of anything going on in there. Scan and Zahn might not have been employed to protect Fluttershy any longer, now that Flash Spark was no longer an issue, but they had settled in Ponyville, explaining that they planned on starting a family of their own, even signing on to the weather team. Zahn had recovered well from the injuries she'd received during her fight with Flash Spark. However, the arm that had been injured in that battle would be stiff and unresponsive for the rest of her life, not that she would allow it to slow her down all that much. That there were no signs of activity in their home wasn't an ominous omen of any kind, but it did strike Don as odd. Landing in front of the door to the cottage, Don perked up his ears, listening for what was going on inside. The sounds coming through the door seemed quieter than they should have been, as though the ponies behind it were doing their best to avoid making any noise. Relaxing and calming his mind, Don allowed his awareness to seep out through the air around him, spreading and moving through the cracks around the door, letting him get a feel for what was going on inside the house. To his surprise, he sensed several ponies on the other side of the door. Once upon a time, the realization would have alarmed him and Don's first thought would have been to expect an attack. However, he realized that the sensations of these ponies were familiar to him. His friends were in there, as well as Fluttershy, Caramel, along with other ponies from all over town. He hadn't thought the cottage had room for so many ponies. Curious as to why so many ponies were visiting, Don pushed open the door. Surprise! Shouted several voices at once, the sensation washing over him like a tangible force. Again, the past Dawn might have retreated several meters to assess the situation and prepare for an attack. But Dawn, as he was now, had already sensed a complete absence of hostility, and the only force the collective shout carried was the weight of the overwhelming enthusiasm of the ponies doing the shouting. He could see them now, assembled in the living room so that all of them had a clear view of the door, all of them with happy grins on their faces. Something fluttering caught Dawn's eye, and he looked up to see a banner strung along the wall above them. His eyes widened as he read out the message spelled out in letters painted the same turquoise as his eyes. "Happy birthday, Dawn," shouted Scootaloo as she bounded forward to hug him tightly. Dawn was too floored to return the embrace, staring blankly up at the banner. "But," he said quietly, looking from one pony to another, "it's not my birthday. At least, I don't think it is. I don't know when it is." "That's okay," squealed Pinky as she bounced over to them, an ear-to-ear grin on her face. "Just because you don't know when your birthday is doesn't mean you can't have one. Every pony needs a birthday because that's when we all get to tell you how happy we are that you're here." "Pinky's right," said Fluttershy, also walking up. Scootaloo still hadn't let go of Dawn, but she did shift over a little to give Fluttershy enough room to hug him as well. Leaning down, she spoke softly into Dawn's ear. "I always tell you I love you, but I want a special day to show you just how important you are to every pony, just how glad we all are that you were born into this world. This is a special day for us and you." For a moment Dawn said nothing. Then, finally, he tilted his head so that he could return Fluttershy's tender nuzzle. "Thank you," he said. "I really am glad that I was born, that I got to meet all of you." Fluttershy kissed Dawn's cheek, and he turned to look at Scootaloo just in time to catch the filly's kiss on his lips. Dawn flinched in surprise, then simply leaned into the kiss and returned it as best he could. Finally, Scootaloo let go and backed up. Dawn's eyes swept across his assembled friends. Aside from Fluttershy, Caramel and Pinkie Pie, Rainbow Dash, Rarity, Applejack, and Twilight Sparkle were all there. Apple Bloom, Sweetie Belle, Spike, and Rumble were there too, along with Rumble's family. Red River and Storm Front stood off to one side, along with Scan and Zon. Arkenstone pressed himself up against Twilight as his muzzle pointed vaguely in Dawn's direction. Ditzy and Dinky stood next to Big Macintosh, who was wearing one of the largest smiles that Dawn had ever seen on the Red Stallion's normally impassive face. Lyra and Bon Bon were there, wearing identical grins. Miss Cheerily was there too. Suddenly, Dawn had an idea as to why she hadn't assigned any homework tonight, even though it was a school night. All of them were looking at Dawn with warm smiles and happy expressions. The entire room seemed filled with their affection. "Do you know what today is?" asked Fluttershy, looking down expectantly at her son. Dawn's ears flicked as he rolled his eyes upward, searching for an answer. Wednesday. A wave of giggles and chortles washed around the room, his mother joining in freely. "Actually, I meant something else," she said. "It's been a full year to the day since we first met back in the forest. Do you remember?" "I do," said Dawn, his eyes widening. "I'll never forget that day for as long as I lived," said Fluttershy, pulling Dawn close and hugging him against her. "That was the day we first met, the first time I ever laid eyes on you. We might not know your actual birthday, but for me, that was the day that you were born to me. So I decided, if you're going to have a birthday, it would be today." "Thank you," said Dawn again, tears leaking out of his eyes. "Thank you so much. I love you, Mom." "I love you too," said Fluttershy, wrapping Dawn in the cocoon of her wings. "Happy birthday." As mother and son cuddled together, the surrounding ponies broke into raucous cheers. The party lasted well into the evening. After Dawn's arrival, Pinky and Fluttershy brought out blankets and set up for dinner in the yard outside the house. Caramel, with some help, produced a hefty dinner to feed every pony. Naturally, Pinkie Pie brought the birthday cake, of which Dawn had a small piece. The sun was down and the moon well into the sky by the time Scootaloo and Melon, the last guests to leave, headed for home. Dawn helped Fluttershy and Caramel to fold the blankets and bring in the dishes for washing. Fortunately, they had the foresight to use paper plates for most of the food, so there was minimal washing that needed to be done. Dawn helped with what he could and was stifling yawns by the time they finished. Despite the relatively late hour, his eyes seemed to want to stay open. So he instead curled up on the couch between Fluttershy and Caramel, content to snuggle with them until he finally fell asleep. "Did you have fun?" asked Fluttershy as she wrapped a wing around him and drew the cold tight against her side. "I did," said Dawn, giving her a small but genuine smile. "It sounds like you enjoyed all the presents," Caramel pointed out. Dawn had received presents from almost every pony. Many of them were small things, things that he appreciated all the same. Arkenstone, working with Twilight and Spike, had created a new blend of tea for him. Coco and Rarity had collaborated to produce a scarf and sweater that Dawn could wear during the fall and winter months. Bon Bon and Caramel had worked to invent new candies that Dawn could enjoy without feeling too woozy. Scootaloo had given Dawn another picture to put up in his room, a picture of the two of them standing together during Twilight's coronation, both proudly wearing the medals that Princess Celestia had bestowed on them. Strangely, though Dawn had only really noticed it in a peripheral sense, the one pony he had not received a present from was the one currently cuddling against his side. He didn't really feel that he needed any kind of present from his mother. Her words affirming their affection for one another and explaining the reason she had picked this day as his birthday had seemed like more than enough of a present for him. "Dawn," said Fluttershy, almost as though she'd read his thoughts, "I haven't given you my present yet." "I don't need one," said Dawn, resting his head on her forelegs. "I know," she said, "but it's a very special present, one that I've been wanting to tell you about for a while now." "What is it?" asked Dawn, blinking and looking up at her. Her choice of words confused him a little. "Well, I hope you'll see it as a present," said Fluttershy, her cheeks turning pink. "I think you will." Dawn remained silent, waiting for Fluttershy to explain. She blushed a little bit harder and seemed to dither for a moment before finally speaking. "Dawn. Yes. How do you feel about being a big brother?" To be concluded. Author's notes. And so the longest, busiest story in the series comes to a close. I called this epilogue both a chapter and an epilogue because I wanted to clarify that though this is an epilogue to this story, it is not an epilogue to the series as a whole. Though, if I wasn't up to continuing, this would probably be as good a point to leave off as any. Naturally, there are plenty of loose threads lying around, questions concerning Dawn's biological parents, his future career, and, of course, his cutie mark. Those questions will be answered in the next and final story in the Savage Skies series, which by and large will serve as something of an extended epilogue for the series as a whole. Right now, I'm still in the process of writing it and it is developing its own distinct arcs and, once again, growing a bit larger than I originally intended. However, its focus should be somewhat narrower because I mostly want to use it to bring Dawn's story to a satisfactory conclusion. The conclusion of other characters' stories will be brought up peripherally, but the next story won't focus on them. As for Dawn's cutie mark, actually, I've been dropping hints for what kind of cutie mark he'll get as far back as the first story. Actually, I didn't actually figure out what his cutie mark would be until I was well into the series but realized that his character had been writing itself from the very beginning, yet another example of how characters grow and take on lives of their own if you write them well enough. Good luck figuring it out. I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone who has been reading and enjoying my series, including all of you who have been pointing out flaws and the occasional plot hole. I'd also like to give special thanks to Mr. Alabaster who made a serious effort to proofread my work despite my overall incompetence with working with an actual proofreader. I may have ended up moving ahead without him, but I'm grateful for the work that he was able to do all the same. Maybe next time. Once again, thank you everyone and hopefully, you won't have to wait as long for the next story. Coming up, the conclusion of the Savage Skies series, title pending.